Chapter 902. Marzola did not care about the security measures of the port. As he spiraled down through the white clouds, he tried his best to look at the sea in the distance. Unsurprisingly, he saw a fleet slowly approaching. Although it did not have the astonishing size of Lessiman's flagship, the Boratini, the fleet that Roddy bought from Lessiman, under the protection of more than 10 modified transport ships, already showed an impressive aura. Compared to the small ships docked in the port, this fleet could definitely be called a behemoth. When he was about to reach the ground, Marzola heard the faint sound of a bell coming from the port. He did not know if it was for the distant fleet or the paratroopers, but this was no longer important. On the open space of the port, there were black smoke torches lit by the intelligence agency personnel 10 minutes ago. 300 Special Forces soldiers divided into 3 batches began to descend one after another. Marzola, who had learned from the previous lesson, did not try to glide at low altitude. Instead, he directly dived down from above the target location and then landed on the ground unscathed with his strong physique. After he landed, he immediately spread out to the sides to make space for his teammates behind him to land. Before the Albatross took off, Marzola had already memorized the map of the entire port and the key points of the mission. So, like the other team members, he immediately ran towards the mission destination without gathering. Pulling out his knuckles, Marzola ran while scanning the scene in the port. The special forces that descended from the sky brought great fear to the people in the port. After all, with so many fully armored soldiers charging in broad daylight, anyone would feel afraid. So the people in his field of vision were generally fleeing in panic. His ears were filled with noisy shouts such as "Murder," "Pirate attack," "Run for your lives," and so on. Obviously, none of them thought that this would be an attack from Ifta. Marzola did not care about the civilians running past him. He just pushed away the people in front of him and ran along the narrow road until he reached a military camp. More than 40 teammates were following behind him. Marzola looked back and saw that Erwin, who was holding a sword and shield, had reached out to pull up the mask of his helmet and made a charge gesture at him. Marzola nodded and held his knuckles with both hands. With a roar, he completely transformed. His huge body leaped out of the corner of the street and then directly rushed into the panicked military camp. After the alarm rang, the soldiers in the barracks hurriedly put on their armor and prepared for battle amid the shouts of the sergeants. However, the port of the imperial city had never been attacked by other forces for many years. The barracks, which had less than 300 people in total, was originally a personal guard under the command of the royal family. Their biggest role was to act as a guard of honor when they welcomed Lassiman's envoy fleet. If there was a real battle, it would be the royal family's matter. But at this time, the Darth, Ocean Empress, and magnificent treasures that were anchored at the port had not prepared for battle at all. Most of the crew were on the shore, so when Marzola's huge body rushed into the military camp, the soldiers who had not even put on their armor scattered in fear on the spot. The sergeants who tried to rush up were directly knocked away by Marzola. He used his violent strength to tear down a door and raised it to block a few arrows from both sides. Then, he led Erwin and the others behind him and directly rushed through the entire military camp. A few archers who occupied the high ground did not even have the chance to shoot their next round of arrows before the soldiers at the back of the special forces directly shot through them with their crossbows. There was no suspense in the subsequent battle. Be it in terms of strength or equipment, the special forces completely crushed the special forces and quickly gained control of the military camp without losing a single person. After that, Erwin took out a signal scroll and cast it into the air. Marzola had already returned to his original form. He quickly climbed to the top of the tower at the northeast corner of the military camp. When he looked in the direction of the port, a red signal from another small team also rose into the air. This meant that they had successfully controlled the port and prevented most of the sailors from returning to the ship. He turned back and made a tactical gesture to Captain Irwin, indicating that, mission completed. But halfway through his action, he stopped because a ship in the distance had forcibly raised its sails and weighed the anchor, slowly leaving the port amidst the shouts and crossfire of arrows. Marzola made another gesture, telling Irwin that, one ship has escaped. But the latter only nodded to indicate that he understood without any extra expression. Marzola continued to stand guard at the corner of the tower. He had excellent eyesight and the high visibility of the port, so he could see the approaching Iferta fleet at a glance. The warship that escaped from the port was called Sea Empress. Because of its slender body, protruding front and relatively light tonnage, after raising its sails, it moved abnormally fast. In just a few minutes, it left the sea near the port and then turned its bow to the east. It seemed like it wanted to escape to a few other small ports in the southeast corner of the kingdom. But before it left Marzola's sight, the Iferta fleet that surrounded the Sea Empress directly blocked all the escape routes of the Sea Empress. Navigating on the sea required the use of flag signals to communicate. Marzora did not really understand what the flags meant, but he soon saw the Iferta fleet, which was originally lined up in 2 vertical rows, slowly move sideways. When they were about a kilometer away from the Sea Empress, a series of flashes appeared on the hull of the ship. After 4 to 5 seconds, Marzola heard the concentrated sound of gunfire. The next moment, the Sea Empress, that was originally trying to make a detour, started to shake violently. A large amount of fire exploded on the hull of the ship, and one of the 3 masts in the middle broke on the spot. The ship that was originally moving at high speed immediately slowed down, and then began to tilt due to the cracks on the hull. After 1 round of concentrated fire, the fast ship that was trying to escape sank directly. This feeling was like a group of adults beating up a child without any suspense. After that, the Iferta fleet directly sailed into the port. After dropping the anchor, teams of fully armed soldiers quickly rushed down from the transport ships at the back. After controlling the main streets according to plan, they went straight to the back door of the palace. The palace and the port were actually next to each other. From the port to the north, after leaving the densely populated area, they could directly enter the South City Gate, on the side of the palace through a small path. As the palace was built on a raised terrain, one could directly see the port and the sea from the palace. When the Iferta fleet used the transport ships to transport more than 1,000 soldiers to the back of the palace, the city was almost unprepared for battle. At this moment, as the monarch, Charles II, was fighting in Enrique City, almost all of the mages were mobilized. In order to gather enough troops to fight at the front line, even the number of patrolling troops was reduced by half, let alone the city defense soldiers. There were only more than 80 imperial guards left in the palace, and this was including the attendants of the queen, the prince, and the princess. There was only 1 mage left who could really fight, and this was the magus that Charles II had specially kept. After the alarm at the port rang, the people in the palace immediately began to prepare for battle. But no matter how they prepared, there were not many people to help defend the huge city. When the armored Iferta infantry division carried the crystal cannons to the closed South City Gate, there were only about 100 people standing on top of the city wall. They ran back and forth carrying the defense equipment that had been dusty for many years. What was even more ridiculous was that the large crossbows on the base of the city wall could not be turned because of the rust at the base. When 7 or 8 soldiers tried to turn it by force, they actually broke the connecting part of the base with a click. At this moment, the 3 artillery squads had already set up the crystal cannons. They immediately activated them and blasted open the fragile city gate. Along the way, a portion of the city wall above the city gate was blasted open. The terrifying power of the crystal cannons directly destroyed the already low morale of the soldiers. The 2 noble knights who were guarding the city yelled at the soldiers who wanted to escape, but they could not stop the Iferta infantry who had already begun to rush into the city. They waved their long swords filled with battle aura in an attempt to stop the soldiers, but before they could even come into contact, they were directly hit by a round of crystal cannons. The poor 2 knights who had advanced strength were directly turned into ashes before they could even touch the enemy. At this moment, the Imperial city was unprecedentedly empty. When the infantry division charged in, they encountered almost no resistance. There weren't even many servants left in the magnificent Imperial palace. When they heard that the city gates had been breached, the few people who were left grabbed whatever belongings they could and fled in panic. The huge palace collapsed before the Iferta soldiers arrived. In the depths of the palace, Princess Rolling carried her crying sister, Claudius, and the second prince, Brazsak. She looked at the eldest prince, Solis, who was holding a short sword in his hand. The latter's face was pale. Although he was wearing a set of exquisite armor, he knew very well what was waiting for him. He looked back at his mother who was crying in the corner and said in a low voice, "I will explain to them. We are the royal family. They will definitely not do anything to us." But even Solis himself did not believe these words. From the time the alarm sounded until now, it had only been half an hour. The enemy had actually breached the port and the city wall. Could it be that these defenses were made of paper? Even if they defended with their lives, they should not be defeated in an instant. Bang! A loud noise came from outside the door. That was because there were still 2 groups of guards guarding the door to the core area of the palace. But after the deafening noise, the battle cry did not sound again. Only the dense sounds of footsteps and armor clashing could be heard. At this moment, the only remaining magus who was guarding the royal family pushed open the door with a magic staff in his hand. He held a scroll in his hand and walked quickly to the 2 princes, Solis and Brazsak. "Go. I will take you away." Solis was a little stunned. He did not understand why the magus would say this at this time. He turned his head and looked at his 2 sisters and mother who were not far behind him. He said, "Let's go together. The teleportation scroll can only send 2 people away. You are the seed of the royal family." Chapter 903. Behind the Archmage, Rolling stared blankly at his actions. Her mind was filled with the words he had shouted out in a moment of desperation. It was obvious that the person who had made the decision was not the Archmage himself. He was merely the one carrying out the order, and the person who had given the order could only be one person. That person was her father, Charles II. When danger came, it turned out that her father only cared about his 2 sons. Rolling looked down at her sister who was at a loss, and then back at her mother who had closed her eyes in despair. She felt as if something in her heart had completely shattered. But just as the Archmage tore open the scroll, the sudden blue light enveloped the 2 of them. The scroll seemed to have received some kind of interference, and the messy space-time turbulence suddenly went out of control. An invisible force smashed the vases on both sides. As the initiator, the Archmage suffered a slight backlash. He staggered a few steps back, then clenched his wand and whispered, "Spell disruption." Damn it, did the enemy have a Archmage with them? Outside the tightly shut door, the footsteps of the soldiers were already very close. He waved his wand and forcibly used magic to freeze the entire door and the wall into a huge block of ice. But just as he finished casting the spell, he realized that there was someone at the window next to him. He immediately pointed his wand, but before he could cast the spell stored in it, the tip of the wand was directly broken by Kardashian. "I don't like being pointed at with a wand." Crack! The elements that exploded were instantly suppressed by some kind of invisible force on the spot, and then directly dissipated in the air. The Archmage wanted to say something, but after seeing Kardashian's dragon horn, he immediately let go of his wand and threw the remaining half to the side. "Your Excellency, I didn't mean to offend." He was very clear that if he started a conflict with the dragons at this distance, he would definitely have a death wish. "Your Excellency Kardashian." Rolling's eyes lit up. She had been chatting with him for the past 2 days. She originally thought that the dragons would not help the royal family at all, but now it seemed that was not the case. Upon hearing her voice, Kardashian turned to look at the members of the Cullen royal family. The other 4 sword-wielding guards in the room had no intention of making a move. After all, they knew that the dragons were on the same side as the Cullen royal family. "Don't worry, I will ensure your safety." Kardashian turned around and smiled at Rolling. Then, with a point of her finger, the ice crystals that froze the door instantly shattered into countless pieces. The door was smashed open by Efta's soldiers. Armed with swords and shields, they rushed into the room in shiny silver armor and surrounded everyone. Rolling and the others were so nervous that they didn't even dare to breathe. Just when they thought that Kardashian was going to start a massacre in the next second, the Dragon Spear Knight, who was the last to enter the house, sheathed his sword and gave a military salute. "Reporting, sir. Mission complete. Stay here for the time being. Just wait for the news in front of you." Kardashian turned her head and looked at the stunned royal family. She smiled and said, "I promise to ensure your safety. Naturally, I won't go back on my word." After she finished speaking, she raised her hand and clenched her fist. A blue formation instantly appeared beneath the feet of the Grand Magus beside her. Before the Grand Magus could even realize what was happening, countless ice chains had bound him firmly from the bottom up. The Grand Magus desperately tried to mobilize his magic power, but he discovered that it was all futile. Kardashian didn't even look at him. She just continued to look at Rolling and said, "Just stay here. This war will be over soon." After saying that, she directly jumped onto the windowsill. After taking a step, she transformed into a giant dragon and suddenly flew in the direction of Enrique City. At this moment, it was close to noon. In Enrique City, all the soldiers were ready for battle. The soldiers led by the nobles were divided into different echelons according to their respective territories. They also received their own designation. It was obvious that this city was about to stage a siege. And as the defending side, the most important task was to resist the waves of the enemy's attack. In order to prevent the situation of soldiers not knowing the general, and the general not knowing the soldiers, this kind of formation based on the Lord could effectively improve the cohesion and combat effectiveness of defending the city. And in order to prolong the war, food and supplies transported from all over the place had been piled up into a mountain near the small square in the north of the inner city. Obviously, Quayo was planning to rely on defending to the death to wear down Ifta's logistics. If there was an opportunity, the ready cavalry would naturally go out of the city to expand the victory. Once the battle started, the royal army would cooperate with the Viper Cross, lying in ambush in the northeast of the battlefield. It was very likely that they would directly defeat the enemy. If Ifta's people attacked the Viper Cross first, then after the enemy's formation changed, facing Enrique City would naturally show their weakness. In this way, Quayo would definitely press forward with tens of thousands of troops. Together with the magic bombardment of the mages, it would also be an advantageous situation. On such a battlefield, no matter how they fought, they would not be at a disadvantage. Therefore, he could be said to be very relaxed. As the command center, Quayo and Charles II stayed alone in a specially built large tent on the city wall. In this way, it was still nominally Charles II holding down the fort and commanding, while a few mages and great nobles stayed outside, waiting for orders at any time. Inside the tent, Charles II naturally sat respectfully at the side, obediently waiting for Quayo's orders. Quayo was in a good mood today, so he was more talkative than usual. The enemy's letter of challenge says that the battle will start at noon today, but in reality, it's just a pretense. Roddy is a guy who will use any means to achieve his goals. He won't fight fair and square. Sir Lord is right. 4 years ago, he was just a nobody. How could he have any sense of honor as an aristocrat in his head? This kind of country bumpkin might even sell his parents just for a mouthful of food. Charles II naturally followed Quayo's words and flattered him, but he was still a little nervous. He asked again, "Sir Lord, what about the Viper Cross?" "They are suitable bait. We can directly test the enemy's trump card." Quayo sat on a spacious armchair. For him, after worrying about the matters of the dragon tribe, fighting on the side of the humans was like playing a game. It could even be said that it was a kind of relaxation for him. Quayo sat on a spacious armchair. In any case, the more obedient the puppet of the royal family was, the better it would be. So now he was quite interested in explaining his strategy to Quayo. After all, under his command, the kingdom of Karen's troops shone with unprecedented efficiency and halo. It was indeed something to show off. After listening to such words, Charles II also felt at ease. The Viper Cross's troops did not completely obey the royal family's orders. The agreement they reached with Charles II was only to assist in the attack. There was no simple relationship between superior and subordinate. So now that the battle was about to start, the cooperation with the Viper Cross could only be discussed. Also, because of the slow communication, it would take half a day to send a message back and forth. This tent was not enclosed. The side facing north could directly see the position of the Iferta army. The distance between the two sides was about 1,800 meters. This distance was just outside the effective range of the crossbows and catapults on the city wall. That should be the Viper Cross. Looking up, Quayo pointed to a small team that suddenly appeared in the distance. Charles II's eyesight was certainly not as good as the dragon's. He could only see a small group of black shadows on the horizon. But based on the movement speed of the other party, he could roughly determine that it was a cavalry unit. Quayo casually said, "Since they have begun to probe, we can't fall behind. Send 3 teams to circle around their position and take a look. Just don't rush too close." Charles II only nodded when he received the order. He then walked out of the tent and coughed twice. "Pass down the order. Let Viscount Avala send out 3 teams of light cavalry to circle around the enemy's position to investigate the situation. Be careful not to go too close. Be careful of their long-range weapons." "Yes, Your Majesty." In front of others, Charles II naturally had to act like a high and mighty monarch. But when he returned to the tent, his expression became humble again. At this time, a Falcon reconnaissance aircraft flew over the sky. Charles II had never seen this thing before. He curiously asked, "My lord, what is this creature?" Quayo narrowed his eyes and stared at it for a long time without saying a word. "You cowardly mice! Do you only dare to hide in the sewers?" Outside the position of the Eiffel Infantry Division known as the Battery, more than 100 meters away from the first layer of trenches, the Viper Cross cavalry stopped and loudly cursed. This was actually a typical battle tactic in the era of cold weapons. When a battle started, both sides would usually send out their powerful lords to confront each other. But the situation on the battlefield was ever-changing. Not all sides could be evenly matched. The main force of the Viper Cross cavalry was still 3 kilometers away, moving towards this place. The Eiffel soldiers were at ease waiting for the exhausted. Because the terrain here was slightly higher, Pope Daize naturally sent people to disturb them to see if he could disrupt the opponent's rhythm. The Viper Cross cavalry that rushed over had different equipment, but they were all marked by white cloaks or jumpers, so they were very conspicuous on the battlefield. In fact, they had already been circling here and cursing for a long time. But the Eiffel troops were different from any other troops they had faced before. No matter how they provoked them, the enemies in front of them were like cold stones, unresponsive. And they were also different from the previous enemies. Under normal circumstances, the infantrymen should be standing in a row at the front. But most of the people in front of them were standing in deep trenches dug out from the ground, only their heads sticking out. Chapter 904. It was not a good idea to just wait, so the cavalrymen could only let their horses continue to move forward. At the same time, they circled around the enemy's position while shouting strangely while observing the enemy's position and distribution of soldiers. But unfortunately, they still did not find anything. Because everyone was hiding in the trenches, he could not see how many enemies there were. Instead, there were things wrapped in camouflage cloth in the center and the rear of the formation, giving off a mysterious aura. What do we do? The soldier beside him was also tired from shouting, so he helplessly gulped down water while asking his superior. The captain gritted his teeth. Then try to get closer. Continue cursing. It's fine if we can make them reveal some of their numbers. With that, he urged his horse forward, and the other soldiers hurriedly followed. This group of scouts were originally mounted bandits, and because they were skilled on horseback, they caught the eye of the bishop of the Viper Cross. In the end, they were recruited by the bishop in exchange for their clean identities. And now, seeing that the enemy was not moving, these fellows, who usually bullied the weak and feared the strong, became even bolder. Brandishing their sabers, they began to circle around the formation and gradually closed in. From a distance of over 100 meters, they closed in to 80, 70, and even some people crossed from a distance of 50 meters. There was still no reaction from the trenches. This made them even more courageous, and a group of more than 20 people even began to draw their bows at this distance, trying to shoot at the soldiers in the trenches. But the soldiers in the front did not care about their attacks. They simply bent down and the arrows could only stab into the trenches, not causing any damage. This group of Viper Cross cavalrymen were not arrogant enough to directly charge at the formation, but when they entered a horizontal line 40 meters in front of the formation, there was a sudden movement from within the formation. Ready, fire! The sound of a crossbow being cocked could be heard from within the trenches. The captain who was patrolling at the front immediately shouted, "Quick, hide!" Their riding skills were superb, and the 20 people who were originally running horizontally all bent their bodies to the side of the saddle. This was the so-called hiding in the stirrups. When faced with a rain of arrows, they often used this method to avoid the damage from the arrows. Being a scout was a high-risk profession, so they were mentally prepared to be hit by stray arrows. But they obviously forgot one fact. They were no longer 100 meters away, but only 40 meters away from the formation. At this time, the frontline soldiers using crossbows were within 60 meters of them, so for them, this wave of concentrated fire was even easier than their usual shooting training. Hundreds of crossbow bolts landed on the slow cavalrymen and warhorses. At this moment, the power of Elson's crossbow was fully displayed. While the crossbowmen of the royal family were using foot-mounted crossbows, Elson's crossbow had been updated to the level of hand-operated pulleys. This meant that the Elson heavy crossbow's crossbow arm had accumulated more than 3 times the energy of an ordinary crossbow. At a distance of around 60 meters, the power of these bolts was comparable to the spears in the hands of the infantrymen. The blankets on the horses were useless against the bolt. The shockingly long bolts pierced through the bodies of more than a dozen horses. Some of the bolts even pierced through the riders beside the horses. Of the 23 knights, more than half fell on the battlefield. Most of them were flung away after their horses fell to the ground, while others were crushed to death by the tumbling bodies of their horses. The luckier ones were still galloping, but the bolts stuck in the horses' bodies had almost pierced through their bodies. After running out, they fell to the ground in pain not long after. This team did not expect to encounter such a powerful attack. After this round of concentrated fire, the entire formation returned to its previous calm. There was no sign that they were ready to charge. The 3 surviving cavalrymen struggled to get up, gritted their teeth, and cut off the bolts on their bodies. They tried to escape step by step. Such a target was not difficult for the Elson crossbow, which was extremely accurate. A small team received the company commander's order and got up to shoot. Each of the 3 men shot an arrow, and there was only a pile of corpses left in front of the formation. Such a scene was seen by the approaching cavalry of Enrique City. They, who were already close to 200 meters away, immediately retreated. The team from the Viper Cross had been completely annihilated. When the news reached the Viper Cross, Pope Dai naturally narrowed his eyes. This kind of thing was not rare on the battlefield. It could only be said that the leading knights were too careless. But Dai was a little unhappy that a team could not bring back any news. At this moment, the infantry formation of the Viper Cross had entered 2 kilometers away from the Ifta formation. The bishops were coordinating the formation, and the Poison Fang chariot, hidden in the formation, had also taken off the fishing nets and rags that were originally used as camouflage. Although it could be called a chariot, this thing was actually a type of intricate catapult. The craftsmen of the Kingdom of Moss had improved the structure of the catapult. Compared to the heavy siege equipment used by the Kingdom of Karen, the Poison Fang chariot only needed 3 people to operate. When there was no livestock to pull it, 4 people could easily operate this lightweight chariot that weighed no more than 400 kilograms. Because of its intricate structure, this catapult could reach a distance of 1 kilometer, although it was not large in size. Its disadvantage was that it could not throw large stones, but its advantage was obvious. It had a high rate of fire. As long as one was familiar with the operation, it could throw 2 to 4 rounds of live ammunition in a minute. And the reason why it was called Poison Fang was because the cannonball it used could release a highly poisonous fog after it was shattered. The Viper Cross had started producing these stone bullets as early as 2 years ago. Because of the low efficiency, the production progress had been very slow. But for this expedition, Dai had brought all his trump cards, in order to achieve victory in one strike. Enrique City is planning to defend to the death. They have no intention of leaving the city to fight. An elder beside him analyzed the situation in a low voice. Dai nodded and replied, "Charles II is ultimately not bold enough, but this is our chance." The gates of Enrique City were tightly shut. If they were planning to fight outside the city, they should have called out the infantry and cavalry by now. But now there were only 3 scattered cavalry squads patrolling back and forth. Dai, who had rich combat experience, knew very well what this meant. He raised his head and glanced at the calm Ifta formation, narrowed his eyes and said, "The team will now rest and reorganize. At noon we will be within a kilometer of the formation. We will be at the upper wind, so when the battle begins, let the Poison Fang chariot bombard the formation directly. All cavalry get ready to chase and kill. I reckon these fellows won't even know how they died." Dai was very confident about this, because the power of the poison gas bomb was more terrifying than a direct bombardment of spells. The trenches could withstand impact and flames, but they could not stop the spreading poisonous fog. The Poison Fang chariot could definitely be called a weapon of mass destruction in this kind of battle. Ifta's army was less than 10,000 people. As long as the poison gas bomb was thrown into the formation, the battle could enter the final stage within 5 minutes. "Your Holiness, Charles II expression will be very interesting when that happens. Of course, I hope that he will not forget to agree to our conditions while he is pleasantly surprised," Dai said as he clenched the scepter in his hand. "I really hope that Duke of Ifta is here too. That way we can take back the scepter as well." The Viper's kiss was the most painful scar in Dai's heart. He had painstakingly awakened the scepter, but it had become the wedding dress of the Rose Cross. This feeling made him want to vomit blood every time he thought about it. But as long as he defeated the enemies in front of him, the scepter would be his sooner or later, Dai thought as he waved his hand to give the order. Complex military orders were transmitted more efficiently and swiftly in the Viper Cross system than in the ordinary noble army. Soon, the hundreds of Poison Fang chariots in the army began to move horizontally, and the infantry formed a protective formation. The cavalry troops gathered on both sides. The fully armed knights of the army of saints looked at the position in front of them with bright eyes, as if they could already see the scene of the enemy fleeing. The wooden wheels of the poison fang chariots creaked, and the carefully packed black poison gas bombs swayed on the wooden cart. The army of saints in white uniforms constantly chanted scriptures and slogans. The army of tens of thousands of people marched forward majestically. Noon was approaching. In the Ifta position, which Roddy had called the fort, Sodeler had already finished the final mobilization meeting with the battalion commanders. Although everything was ready, the few young people in the advisor team were still constantly mapping the distance between Enrique City and the Viper Cross, as well as the number of troops. In their hands they held the image that the Falcons had just sent back. In it, the distribution of the troops in Enrique City was clear at a glance. "Commander, a war like this will definitely leave our name in history. Maybe it will also be a curse." Sodeler looked at Enrique City, which was directly opposite the tent, and said with some inexplicable emotion, "A battle like this will actually have the same result as a face-to-face charge. But for them, this kind of ending, perhaps the meaning of fear is stronger." The advisors also felt some pressure in their hearts, because a war like this concerned the life and death of tens of thousands of people. Even if they were in their shoes, they would not be able to remain calm. One of them whispered, "Commander, let's go and stay in the bunker." "Oh, this is the rule. Let's go." This battle was different from the previous battles. Sodeler ordered all the soldiers to stay in the bunker until they received the order to attack. Although the soldiers felt strange, obeying orders had become instinctive. This Iron Army had now completely become a veritable war machine, and would only faithfully carry out the orders of their superior. Sodeler and the advisors were all dressed in armor, and they also carried a protective scroll on them. This was standard equipment for everyone above the company commander level. After walking out of the central tent, from this angle, they could see hundreds of crystal cannons lined up on the left and right, which were in the process of removing camouflage, as well as the layers of trenches in front of the position. Sodeler walked into the trenches, but before entering, he looked back at a corner of the tent area. There was only a circular space there, but Sodeler saluted there. Chapter 905. The soldiers in Enrique's city were very calm, because when the feudal lords announced the order of rotation, they realized that this would be a long and drawn-out battle for the defense of the city. Moreover, the proportion of casualties in a defensive battle was relatively small. For the soldiers at the bottom, they only needed to continuously shoot arrows, throw things, and carry supplies. As long as they did not rush out of the city and fight the enemy head-on, most people would feel an indescribable sense of calmness and superiority. Charles II had the same thought. He stood on the city wall and looked left and right. The passageways on both sides were filled with soldiers armed with bows and crossbows. Moreover, there was a mage in a magic robe standing at a certain distance. With them around, even if the enemy was an elite division, they would still have to pay a huge price to approach the city wall. Moreover, Lord Quio was right beside him at this moment. The kind of blazing heat that was like standing next to a volcano made him feel the power of the world's top echelons at all times. "It's already noon." Charles II squinted his eyes and looked straight ahead. "But it looks like they don't seem to be moving at all?" "I told you, they're just bluffing." Quio could see more clearly than Charles II. The posture of the soldiers 1,800 meters away could not escape his eyes. But just as he was about to continue mocking them, he suddenly stopped and looked into the distance. "There's movement?" Charles II tried his best to look, but could only see a blurry black spot. He gulped and looked back at the city. The open space and passageways below the city wall were filled with reserve soldiers. Near the city gates on the east and west sides were knights leading their war horses. Because there were too many people, the strong smell of horse dung could be smelled here. but this smell gave him a sense of security. Thinking that there were so many soldiers and knights around him, his fear of the enemy naturally dissipated. No. They don't intend to attack, but Quio suddenly froze. He immediately stood up and raised his hand to cast a spell. He gave the signal to the mages on both sides to open the defensive barrier. Charles II didn't know what was going on, but the mages who received the signal knew that they should execute the order and started casting their spells. Magical fluctuations and buzzing sounds echoed continuously, and a combination of different colors immediately appeared in front of the city wall. And as soon as such a barrier was formed, a series of colliding sounds echoed. The crackling sound startled Charles II. He took a closer look and realized that there were many fallen black stones on the ground in front of the city wall. In the distant sky there was also a muffled sound. Bang! One of them smashed right in front of Charles II, but Quio's defensive boundary was exceptionally sturdy. It didn't even leave a mark on it. The boundary of the mages on both sides wasn't as sturdy. The boundary of two low-ranked mages was penetrated on the spot. Fortunately, the black stones smashed into the city wall. Apart from a small piece of rubble, no one was injured. However, this attack made Charles II nervous. He already had a shocking guess in his heart, so he asked hesitantly, Is this Efta's attack? Although he asked this, he couldn't accept the fact that the royal family's best ballista only had an effective range of 400 meters. Although they could reach a distance of 1,500 meters, there was no way to aim at that distance, and the error was huge. The distance between the two sides was nearly 2 kilometers. If the enemy could attack the city wall at this distance— No, while he was thinking, Quio's expression suddenly changed. Charles II looked up and discovered that a series of lights suddenly flashed in the enemy's position in the distance. In the blink of an eye, a large number of fast-moving black shadows appeared in the sky and headed straight for him. Damn it! They actually tricked me! Quio stood up angrily. Charles II's face was full of doubt. But in the next moment, a violent explosion suddenly rang in his ears. This round of attacks wasn't solid calibrated bullets, but crystal cannonballs that contained immense power. In an instant, the defensive boundary of the mages blossomed amidst the explosion. There were a total of more than 120 large-caliber crystal cannons in Efta's position, and they began their first mass shooting. The energy and impact of the crystal explosions caused the shields of these mages to be as fragile as glass. Because of the adjustment of the first round of calibrated bullets, in this round of attacks, more than half of the cannonballs were directly aimed at the city wall. In the face of such weapons, the defensive boundary was blown to pieces on the spot, and the shock wave that swept over from behind caused the soldiers and mages on the city wall to stagger. In this round of concentrated shooting, most of the cannonballs didn't hit the city wall but exploded on the boundary. Therefore, most of the soldiers on the city wall were only shaken down by the impact. They climbed up and looked around in confusion, asking loudly what had happened. Because at this moment, basically no one could understand how such an attack happened, or rather, they still couldn't believe that this was done by the soldiers 2 kilometers away from Efta. And just when they were at a loss, the third round of concentrated shooting landed on the city wall after a delay of a few seconds. Charles II stared blankly in front of him. He felt as though the world in front of him was instantly engulfed by red flames. The city wall under his feet looked as though it had been ruthlessly swung by a giant's warhammer. Even Quio's defensive boundary couldn't withstand the direct bombardment of 7 or 8 cannonballs and shattered in an instant. Just when he thought he was about to be engulfed by the flames, the dragon's overlord beside him directly activated his own fire shield. Powerful elemental waves resisted the physical impact of the crystal explosions. The unprecedented strenuous feeling caused the overlord's expression to change. For the first time, he discovered that as a dragon's overlord, it was possible for him to be injured by a human's attack. The violent impact completely blew up the tents and even the tower on top of the city wall. If it wasn't for the large range of Quayo's shield, Charles II would have most likely turned into pieces flying in the air. At the same time, the middle section of the city wall that was originally filled with soldiers and mages was completely wiped out by the flames and explosions. Regardless of whether it was a low-level or a high-level mage, there was no way for them to survive such a dense bombardment. The shields were instantly shattered, and the people's bodies were completely torn apart by the power released by the crystal explosions. More than 50 people were directly sent flying to the bottom of the city wall and fell to their death. The entire northern city wall of Enrique City collapsed in 2 sections on the spot. Apart from Quayo and Charles II, there were no more than 3 survivors within a radius of 50 meters. In the next moment, Quayo had already used a spell to grab Charles II and directly levitated backward. As soon as the 2 of them left the city wall, the 4th round of concentrated shooting passed under their feet. The landing point of the cannonballs was no longer aimed at the city wall but inside the city. Hundreds of crystal cannonballs seemed to have been calculated in advance. Some of them landed within a range of 20 to 30 meters behind the city wall, while the others directly extended to both sides and smashed right near the east and west city gates that were 200 meters away. At this moment, Charles II, who was floating in the air, felt as though he was in hell. He stood in the air and looked down at the densely packed soldiers in his field of vision being engulfed by the sea of fire. This feeling made one's senses dull. Charles II seemed to clearly see the entire process of the crystal cannonball exploding. The metal bullet, which was about the size of a helmet, expanded and exploded after landing on the ground. The charged crystal shone with a blue light when it released energy. Because the energy was too dense, the light quickly turned into orange or even bright yellow flames. In the process of spreading, it ignited and collapsed everything, causing everything in the surroundings to be smashed into pieces. Charles II saw the terrified soldiers trying to escape, but because they were standing too close together, they fell down in large numbers. They were like dehydrated fish, desperately stepping on other people to struggle into the distance. However, a shell fell, and when the intense fire disappeared, only a deep, charred pit was left on the ground. Within a radius of 7 or 8 meters, there was nothing left except charred and carbonized corpses. Not a single moving object was left. A cannonball hit the city wall, and the seemingly thick and sturdy wall broke in the middle on the spot. The collapsed stones fell into the crowd, and several unlucky people's heads were smashed open. The buildings in the city were even more defenseless. A cannonball landed in the middle of the street, and the impact and flames it brought directly collapsed 3 or 4 houses next to it. The flames spread rapidly, and the entire northern part of Enrique City was completely covered in 3 consecutive rounds of artillery fire. Quayo quickly retreated. Charles II, who was dragged along with him, looked around with a sluggish expression. He saw that the places where a large number of knights were gathered on both sides were also hit by the same cannonball. The enemy's attack was exceptionally accurate. Almost half of the cannonballs fell in the areas where the soldiers were densely packed. This also meant that the tens of thousands of soldiers that Charles II had painstakingly gathered were directly killed or injured within 10 minutes. He could no longer hear the screams of the nobles and soldiers because his ears were almost deafened by the explosions. Why is this happening? Charles II desperately hoped that this was just a nightmare, but when Quayo, with a gloomy expression, placed him on the square in the middle of the city and began to pace back and forth in deep thought, the king of the kingdom of Karen understood that everything was over. Without an army, he had no sovereignty. Under such an attack, it was unknown how many of the nobles in the city wall area could survive. What made him feel the most despair was that not only were the mages blasted to pieces on the spot, even Quayo, the Lord of the Dragons, had to retreat to avoid the brunt of the attack. There was only one question left in his heart: is this really something that humans can do? Chapter 906. At the same time, the Viper Cross Pope, who was in the middle of the army, had the same question in his mind. From where he stood, he could see the light and roar of the giant cannons on the high ground in front of him. At the same time, he could see the crumbling walls of Enrique's city in the distance. When he realized the range and power of the enemy's attack, Daizé did not hesitate to blow the bugle and begin the attack. Damn it! What kind of weapon are they using? Daizé, who was riding on horseback, was a little flustered. At this time, the army was about 1,700 meters away from Efta's position on the high ground. The effective range of the Venomfang tank was already very long, but it was only about 1,000 meters at most. The enemy's heavy cannons had directly blown up the city wall nearly 2 kilometers away. In comparison, Daizé did not think that he could escape the attack of such a weapon. Since the cannons could hit Enrique City, they could also hit him. Therefore, the only thing he could do now was to speed up and rush to the high ground before the enemy turned their target to him. Speed up! Speed up! Even if we don't have the stamina to rush there, it's better than dying on the road. His hand that was gripping his staff was full of sweat, and his whole face was as tense as a mask. The mages desperately cast magic to speed up the soldiers, but the movement of nearly 10,000 people, coupled with the burden of the Venomfang tank, immediately caused the orderly army to fall apart. But just as the cavalry began to speed up, preparing to break away from the main force and charge forward, a dense roar came from the sky. Pope Daizé raised his head and saw 2 black silhouettes on the horizon rapidly flying in their direction. They seemed to have already adjusted their course and were flying straight at them. Daizé had seen these things many times, but he still did not know what they were. But when the huge albatross transport plane behind them appeared in their field of vision, everyone realized that something was wrong. The falcon flew over their heads. The albatross was only flying at an altitude of about 1,000 meters. It flew over the artillery position where Efta's soldiers were, and then, as it was about to fly over the Viper Cross army, it began to drop black objects from the rear cabin. The Viper Cross infantrymen at the forefront of the formation raised their heads to look at the sky, watching as the black object with a tail rapidly plummeted down, directly smashing into the formation of infantrymen. Boom! Daizé, who was 200 m away, witnessed the explosion of this bomb. Blue light blossomed. With the shock wave, a large number of broken limbs were thrown high into the air. Everything within a radius of over 30 m was completely devoured by flames. Black smoke rose like mushrooms. The terrifying shock wave could even blow away knights 100 m away. What was even more frightening was that these blows were continuous. The sorcerers on the Albatross quickly dropped more than 70 air bombs. When Daizé saw the black shadows flying towards him, he immediately jumped off his horse and shouted, "Dodge! Dodge!" With the help of magic, Daizé's every step was as swift as flying on flat ground. However, there were too few people who could do what he did. The high-ranking Saint Knights protecting him did not realize the severity of the problem and instinctively turned their horses to the sides. As for the elders, they were squeezed in the middle of the group. When they heard the Pope's warning, they were already one step too late in casting their spells. The flames swallowed everything in an instant. The crystal equivalent of each bomb was more than 3 times that of the cannons. In order to save costs, these bombs were made of wood that had been enchanted with solidification. However, to increase the lethality, the tails of the bombs were filled with all sorts of metal fragments. Thus, when the front part of the warhead pierced into the ground and triggered the crystal to explode, the fragments stored in the tails would cause a large area of damage. And when a series of bombs fell directly into the densely packed crowd, each bomb could kill tens or even hundreds of people on the spot. In the era of cold weapons, it was impossible to imagine the terror of aerial bombardment with firearms. Currently, the Viper Cross concept of battle was still at the stage of relying on numbers to win. However, they did not know that this kind of formation was the favorite target for carpet bombing. Within half a minute, more than 70 bombs landed on the ground. Although they did not cover the entirety of the Viper Cross army, they still managed to engulf more than 70% of the infantry troops in a sea of fire caused by the release of energy crystals. Only the cavalry on both sides were lucky enough to escape the bombardment. However, this kind of attack that was even more terrifying than a forbidden spell had completely destroyed their morale. The knights of the army of saints who had been shouting their slogan could only do their best to control their horses, which had been startled by the impact and the loud explosions. Faced with the attack from the sky, these cavalry discovered that they could do nothing but passively take a beating. Charge! The enemy was still 2 kilometers away. In front of them, the orange-red flames formed a sea. The people in the middle of the infantry formation had been wiped out on the spot. The soldiers at the edge of the formation who hadn't died from the impact were now crawling out with their bodies covered in flames. Some of the cavalry jumped off their horses, wanting to drag them out of the sea of fire. However, when they got closer, they discovered that these people's bodies were covered in large wounds caused by metal fragments. The blood that flowed out had been scorched black by the fire. Often, not even a few minutes after they were dragged out of the area, they would die from the burns in their respiratory tracts and excessive blood loss, and an even more terrifying accident had yet to come. When Pope Daizé crawled up from the ground, his face covered in dirt, the first thing he saw was the poison Fong war chariots and the poison gas bombs in the center of the battlefield. And to his horror, those war weapons that he had spent so much blood and sweat to create had already been completely destroyed by the impact and flames. And the dark green poison gas had also spread along with the destruction of the poison gas bombs. When this poison gas came into contact with the soldiers on both sides, they immediately began to howl in pain. The soldiers who had been operating the poison Fong war chariots began to madly scratch at their faces and exposed skin. Pustules almost immediately covered their entire bodies. Afterwards, these soldiers' throats were completely mute from breathing in the poison gas. When they noiselessly fell to the ground, their faces were covered in pus and blood, their deaths abnormally miserable. Hurry and retreat from that area. Hurry! Daizé shouted with all his might, but only now did he realize that his personal guards had not been able to dodge in time and had all disappeared in the explosion. Looking around, he saw that the only thing left where he had been standing was a giant pit. The ground was covered in scorched black severed limbs. Those elders had disappeared without a trace. Most likely, not even their corpses were intact. How could the top fighting force of the church be gone just like that? Daizé's ears were buzzing after the explosion. Not far in front of him, the poison gas had already begun to spread. Some of the knights who wanted to help the wounded were enveloped by the poison gas, then screamed and fled into the distance. This scene caused widespread panic among the hesitating cavalrymen. In order to avoid the poison gas, they all turned around and began to run. Very quickly, the cavalry's morale began to collapse on a large scale. Daizé alone was powerless to stop these cavalrymen from fleeing. He could only raise the scepter in his hand and use his magic to heal the wounded soldiers around him. He also pulled up the mages who had not yet been burnt to death and did his best to release the holy force field to block the poison gas that was about to spread. If not for the fact that the Albatross transport plane's bomb-carrying capacity was not strong enough, this round of bombing would have basically annihilated the entire Viper Cross army. But in the end, the 70 bombs were not able to protect all the soldiers. The last bomb detonated 40 meters behind Pope Daizé. The 2,000 soldiers behind him were not attacked. But at this time, they were already scared out of their wits and were in a state of collapse at any time. Under such circumstances, Daizé immediately made a decision. He gathered a dozen bishops and after isolating the poison gas in front of them, he immediately called for the surviving soldiers to retreat. He then used the levitation spell and holy light spell to attract the attention of the panicking soldiers, and used the amplification spell to stabilize the morale of the troop. Then, he immediately let the soldiers at the back become the vanguard and retreated in an orderly manner. This series of orders was not complicated, but after Dai Ze had issued all of them, he turned back to look at the battlefield in front of him. The isolated poison gas had completely enveloped the struggling soldiers. After being bombed, the 6,000 soldiers at the front were now covered by the spreading poison gas. There was no way for them to survive. No matter how shocking the slogans they had shouted, a cruel reality was right in front of them. The 6,000 main force had completely disappeared in 5 minutes. Out of the 13,000 soldiers of the Viper Cross army, nearly half of them had died. This kind of loss was unbearable to any army. Gritting his teeth, Dai Ze retreated from the battlefield on foot. The existence of the poison gas made it impossible for them to even collect the corpses. This kind of humiliating failure made everyone's heart abnormally heavy. Chapter 907. The first bombing mission has been successfully executed. The staff read the message from the communication circle aloud, and the others in the underground command post cheered quietly. Sodeler's expression did not change much. He just waved his hand and said, "Wait for the follow-up report from Falcon." After the battle began, everyone obeyed the rules and stayed in this underground bunker. After all, this was not an ordinary battle, so even if Sodeler wanted to go out and see the situation of the enemy, he had to suppress his excitement and calm down to wait for news. In fact, even if he went out now, he would not see anything substantial. At this distance, the city of Enrique, which was 2 kilometers away, was nothing more than a mound. The Viper Cross army in the other direction was similar. They looked like a moving psoriasis on the green plains. After the bombardment, only black mushroom clouds could be seen, and the casualties could not be seen from here. But the results of Falcon's investigation were quickly reported. When he heard that more than half of the Viper Cross army had died and the rest had retreated, Sodeler finally clenched his fists and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. At this time, he could not suppress his excitement, because the situation in Enrique was also reported at the same time. The entire northern part of the city wall had collapsed more than 200 meters, most of the main forces had been affected by the bombardment and suffered heavy casualties. At this moment they were in the stage of full recovery. How much longer until the artillery battery cooled down? Sodeler glanced at the magic clock next to him, and the staff immediately reported, "Commander, it will be ready in 15 minutes. After 6 consecutive bombardments, the metal barrels had to cool down and dissipate heat to ensure their service life. At this moment, the artillery battery position lived up to its name at this moment. Hundreds of heavy cannons fired at the same time, and the sound was even more terrifying than a lightning storm. At this moment, the soldier Bucky looked back at the artillery position behind him. In his vision, the artillery soldiers next to the giant cannons were pouring water on the barrels to cool them down. The steam from the hot metal kept rising, and the heat caused the air to distort. The soldiers were all soaked, but no one dared to slack off. The soldiers who exchanged buckets of water were all trotting all the way, as if the water was more important than the gold. The dense steam was quickly blown away by the magic wind cast by the mages. 10 mages stood in a row, raised their staffs, and constantly circulated the strong wind between the artillery positions. Behind them, more than 200 soldiers were moving the crystal cannonballs that were to be used for the next round of bombardment to the trucks. Bucky buried his head back in the trench, feeling that the infantry company had suddenly become the most idle unit in the war. In the previous battle, the soldiers were still able to push forward with weapons in hand, even charging into towns or cities to face the enemy. But now? Everyone had been listening to the roar of the cannons behind them for 20 minutes, and now there wasn't even an order to advance. "What do you say about the enemy, Bucky?" Private West, who was beside him, asked. Who knows? He must have been blasted into smithereens. Didn't all those who stood in front of the artillery team end up like this? He replied in a low voice as he stared blankly at the Elrond's sword in his hand. It had only been half a month since the war started, but he already felt like a veteran. When there were no orders, he felt more and more like a machine that could not think. When he was on standby here, his heartbeat would not even quicken. Reporting, Captain. First Artillery Squad's cooldown is over. Class 3. Cooldown complete. Class 6. Cooldown complete. The roar of the artillery team could be heard. Bucky glanced at his comrade beside him and silently put down his sword. Then, he put his hands under his helmet and covered his ears with force. Adjustment complete. Request to fire. Fire approved. Ready to fire? A series of violent roars rang out. Even with his ears blocked, Bucky felt the earth and his head shaking together. The power of these cannons was too terrifying. But amidst the sound of the cannons, there was only one question left in his mind. Was this really an equal war? Charles II did not know the thoughts of an ordinary soldier a few kilometers away, but his current state of mind was indeed able to answer the other party's question. The war was over. This was the only thought in his mind. The artillery fire that lasted for 20 minutes directly blew up his main force in the northern part of the city into minced meat. Then came the accurate bombardment of the cavalry troops at the city gates on both sides. Countless horses fell in the city's corridors, and the cavalry who could not dodge in time suffered heavy losses. No matter how much they boasted about their martial arts or how strong their armor was, at this moment, in front of the crystal cannons, the result was the same. Many people hid in the stone buildings, but as a result, a cannonball landed outside, and the people inside the stone houses were directly shocked to death. This result made people feel abnormally desperate. The only fortunate thing was that after the 20 minutes of artillery bombardment ended, everything returned to normal. What echoed in Charles II's ears were only cries and wails. The survivors climbed up with ashen faces and then tried to find their comrades under the ruins and rubble. However, what they could dig out were mostly broken corpses. Quayo was nowhere to be found. Charles II, wearing silver armor, walked on the street with a dull look in his eyes. When he saw a retainer next to him pull out a piece of intestine from the debris, he finally could not hold it in anymore. Leaning on the wall next to him, he vomited. Bang! The personal guards were all dead, or it could be said that the nobles, mages, and soldiers near the city wall who were ready to go had disappeared in the artillery bombardment. Therefore, there was no one by the side of this monarch. The terrified squires did not know who Charles II was. They were more worried about their own lives. Many of them desperately ran towards the center of the inner city. Because only the center of the inner city did not receive any artillery shells during the bombardment. Your Majesty? Someone suddenly spoke. Charles II turned his head and saw that it was a young man in his 20s. The other party was wearing armor that did not fit him very well. It seemed to have been passed down from his ancestors. Judging from the epaulets, the other party should be a knight. But at this time, Charles II did not care about the other party's identity. He immediately asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Jeremy, a knight of the Paxson territory." "Your Majesty." Paxson was not far from the imperial city, which meant that the other party was indeed his subordinate. Charles II recovered from his daze, cleared his throat, and ordered, "Very well, Jeremy, I will now promote you to the captain of the Royal Guards. I need you to immediately gather a team of 10 people to ensure my safety." The knight was stunned for a moment and then said loudly, "That would be my honor, Your Majesty." He immediately turned to the ruins and shouted loudly, seeming to be gathering his retainers. Not long after, 4 or 5 people with dusty faces came over. Jeremy had them bring weapons to protect His Majesty's safety. Then he found that there were no soldiers with combat power around, so he said goodbye to Charles II and planned to go to the center of the city to gather more people. "Your Majesty, I'll be right back." The knight trotted away from his sight. Seeing that there were a few people around him, regardless of their strength, Charles II felt more at ease than before. He wiped the corner of his mouth and said, "Follow me, let's go to the inner city together." Charles II also felt that the inner city should be safe, so he decided to follow Jeremy's trajectory. He raised his head and looked at Jeremy, who was trotting 70 to 80 meters away. He had just taken 2 steps when he suddenly heard a whistling sound coming from the sky. "Something's wrong." His expression changed drastically, and he was about to speed up and escape to the inner city when he found that a large number of artillery shells had already poured down on the buildings in front of him. Boom! Amidst the explosion, the oncoming impact directly knocked the monarch away. The rubble hit his face, causing him to be in so much pain that he could not open his eyes. When he regained control of his body, the soldiers who had just gathered around him were all lying on the ground, struggling to get up. Turning his head to look, a soldier who had just been standing beside him was now lying beside him. Half of his head had been cut off by a stone, and blood was flowing down. The bloody scene almost made Charles II vomit again. He gritted his teeth and sat up. Then he was shocked to find that the streets and buildings in front of him had all collapsed and been destroyed in the explosion. His field of vision was much wider than before, but the place where Jeremy had just run had become a large circular crater. The fire burned, but no one got up to put out the fire. Under such bombardment, the people hiding in the buildings were either killed by the shock or crushed to death. There was no other outcome. Charles II gritted his teeth and stood up. He looked down and found that there were many scratches and dents on his armor from the stones. Fortunately, there were not many wounds on his body. He wanted to speak, but he felt that his mouth was full of dirt. After vomiting twice, he pulled up the stunned soldier beside him. "Let's not go to the inner city. Let's go to the northern city wall first." Looking from here, the inner city wall had already been blasted out of a corner. He now realized that the other party did not bombard the inner city earlier, not because the range was not enough, but because they deliberately aimed at the crowded outer city. From another perspective, the northern city wall, which had already been hit, should be a relatively safe position. His left thigh was in pain from being hit by a stone, so he took out the gorgeous sword and used it as a walking stick to move forward. The remaining 4 guards supported each other and followed on both sides. The group had only taken 5 steps when the next round of artillery shells arrived. However, this time, the artillery shells were concentrated on the south side of the city, and the closest point of impact was 100 meters away from Charles II. At this time, Charles II, who was walking, had no fear. He had already entered a state of resignation and even looked forward to the bombs being piled under his feet. If he died directly, he would not have to face the current situation where he lost everything. Chapter 908. The flying Moralis no longer looked like a normal dragon. With 6 wings, she mimicked a giant insect in the forest known as the Tefla dragonfly. The 6 pairs of wings greatly improved her flying ability. With the blessing of the nature's heart, Moralis also had the ability to become invisible. When she flew at her fastest speed, her figure in the domain would disappear from the sight of most creatures. Even an elite red dragons like Iskar could not block her attack. His shield was shattered, and he was sent flying by a palm strike. Then, he was entangled by the vines and fell to the ground. Needless to say, the power displayed by Moralis was not as violent and powerful as Quio's, but it was extremely efficient. She did not pursue extreme damage, but she used the fastest method to make more than 20 dragons lose their combat power. When she looked back at Quio, who was still chanting a spell, her expression was meaningful. However, when she glanced at Roddy's expression, she found that he did not look anxious at all. Instead, he looked unusually calm, as if he had expected everything in front of him. This feeling made Morales feel uneasy. She recalled the whole process of her conversation with Roddy and thought about what he had just said. She could not imagine how a human could remain calm in such a situation. Was it because of the magic tower? In fact, Morales had long seen that the magic tower was strong in appearance but weak in reality. It could only attack and control targets within the range of the enchantment. Against the young dragons further away, it could only stare at them helplessly. And the mage who controlled the magic tower did not have a real body at all. How could a mage who existed purely in the state of a soul fight against a real dragon's lord? Kaio's incantation gradually came to an end. The clouds in the sky had already been rolled into a ring by the elemental vortex. His body was surrounded by a bright orange light, and the blazing temperature had already caused the air to distort. Kaio's forbidden spell was not a directional spell, but a buff that strengthened his overall body, burning blood. It was called a forbidden spell not only because it was powerful. In fact, the power of any spell cast by a demigod lord of dragons was immeasurable. The strength of burning blood was that it did not simply condense elemental power. Instead, it used Kaio's own dragon blood as the price to give himself unparalleled flying and close-quarters combat ability for a period of time. In other words, this was a powerful spell used for one-on-one duels. Efta's magic tower was not a threat in his eyes, but Morales, who was behaving strangely, was. A large amount of blood flowed out from the gaps of the scales all over his body. Kaio raised his head and roared. Amidst the deafening dragon roar, the blood instantly disappeared in the surrounding light. The next moment, Kaio's figure suddenly rushed out. He did not even have the time to flap his wings. Morales, who was dodging at high speed, spiraled upwards to avoid his pursuit. However, Kaio, who had activated the forbidden spell, was too fast. He was like a second sun that streaked across the sky. With a dazzling light, he crossed the entire battlefield and directly caught up with the Green Dragon Lord. During this process, a young green dragon blocked in front of Kaio. When Kaio flew past, it even wanted to open its mouth to bite him. But in the next second, this green dragon, that was more than 10 meters long, spun and flew into the distance. Its body was directly burnt by the high temperature and became a smoking wreckage. When it landed on the ground, it turned into a large piece of charred black debris. Bang! Kaio easily destroyed all the shields of Morales, who was desperately trying to dodge. A burst of green light flashed on Kaio's body, but it did not make him hesitate. The dragon claws wrapped in flames hit the green dragon's body. 2 of Morales' wings were broken on the spot, and they drooped weakly at his side. She cried out in pain, but her body quickly shrank. After turning into a human, she disappeared in the air. With the advantage of invisibility and her body size, she managed to dodge Kaio's second attack. However, before she could fly far, Kaio, who had also transformed into a human, had already caught up with her like lightning. The elemental explosions caused by the collision of the 2 domains could be heard continuously, but Morales was obviously at a disadvantage. Kaio easily punched her in the shoulder. A punch from a demigod was not a simple physical attack. The impact of the punch sent Morales crashing to the ground. And the aftermath of this punch spread to the shield of the Helsinki Magic Tower, which was hundreds of meters away. It almost collapsed on the spot. Boom! With a muffled sound, Morales, who was in human form, was smashed straight into the ground. Kaio swooped down from above, but before he landed, a white light suddenly lit up beside him. He thought that his opponent wanted to attack him. When he turned his gaze, he saw the scene of Roddy raising his bow and shooting an arrow into the sky. What is he doing? Kaio didn't think that shooting an arrow in this kind of battlefield could hurt the dragons. However, just when he was puzzled, the arrow bloomed with a blue arcane halo in the air. After this signal, Quayo suddenly found that the ground in front of him was covered with a white fog. His expression changed, and he immediately said angrily, "Krupus, are you also planning to plot against me?" The crystal dragons were best at using illusions. This fog was the characteristic of the crystal dragons when they used illusion spells. The most important thing was, the white fog could only be seen when the spell disappeared. In other words, this area was not what he saw just now. It was an illusion created by the crystal dragons. An illusion that even Quayo couldn't detect must have been created by a guy at the level of Krupus. He immediately shouted his opponent's name, and a flash of fear flashed in his heart. In order to prevent a sneak attack, he waved his hands in all directions. A strong wind pressure immediately rushed out and blew away the thick fog. When he landed on the ground, he saw the green dragon Moralis slowly standing up in front of him, and the humanoid Krupus holding a staff not far away from her. Moralis also had a surprised expression at this moment. Obviously, she didn't know that Krupus was lying in ambush here. But it seemed that he was here to protect Efta and the other humans. With this thought, her face, which was injured by Quayo, showed a confident expression. "Quayo, are you still going to continue to be stubborn?" Quayo, whose body was burning with flames, clenched his fists. For a moment, he also regarded Krupus as Moralis' ally. He looked at him and whispered, "What does this mean?" Krupus held a crooked wooden staff in his hand and glanced at Quayo and Moralis. He shook his head, and as the tip of the staff touched the ground with a thud, the surrounding smoke began to slowly dissipate. The next moment, Quayo and Moralis' faces showed a shocked expression. Because as far as they could see, they were surrounded by dragon fledglings. The dragon fledglings of the red dragons and green dragons had just fought in the sky. Previously, because of the existence of the Helsinki Magic Tower, there was a large number of casualties. Quayo thought that his dragon fledglings had suffered heavy losses. But now, he saw that there were no motionless corpses on the ground. Instead, there were figures that were struggling but could not move because of the magic array. Their bodies were covered with ice chains. There were green dragons and red dragons. With a cursory look, it was obvious that most of them were not injured. They were simply imprisoned by magic. In other words, in the illusion just now, the opponents they were fighting were probably fake. Thinking deeper, even the enchantment of the Helsinki Magic Tower might be fake. Everything was an illusion created by the crystal dragon. What was going on? Quayo thought that he had fallen into a desperate situation because Morartha's previous words clearly showed that she had joined forces with the other lords. But now, why were the red dragons and green dragons not injured? What was Krupus trying to do? Quayo, stop it. It is not honorable to attack humans. Krupus's words made Morarth happy. Although she did not know why the other party would set up a maze here, it was obvious that he was talking about Quayo. So, the Green Dragon Lord followed up and said, "Now that things have come to this, do you still want to kill me?" The deaths of the other dragon fledglings were fake, but the horrifying wound on her shoulder was real. Her collarbone had collapsed, and her shoulder was slowly recovering. The green dragons had always been known for their tenacious vitality. At this moment, her healing ability was evident. She deliberately showed the wound, as if she was silently accusing Quayo of brutality. The latter was at a loss for words. He was stunned and did not know how to answer. Krupus turned to look at her and said, "Morarth, what you want to do is only to stop Quayo? What do you mean?" Morarth frowned. She felt that the other party's attitude was a little strange. But before Krupus could reply, she felt a chill coming from behind her. As soon as she turned around, Morarth found that Victor was standing behind her. The Ice Dragon Lord was looking at her, and the last syllable of the spell had been silently chanted. The bone-chilling cold spread instantly. Only then did Morarth realize that the other party was trying to imprison her. She immediately tried to struggle, but the spell she was about to chant was disrupted by a distorted elemental power. Krupus's psychedelic realm was colorless and invisible, but it had an extremely strong disturbance spell effect. Most importantly, it was obviously targeted at her. Morarth tried to remove the effect of the frost imprisonment by transforming, but under the attack of the two ice dragon lords, she was caught off guard. Just as she stretched out her arms, Victor rushed over and punched her in the back, causing her to kneel on the ground. That violent frost power invaded her body along with Victor's fist, causing her to be unable to even spit out half a syllable. Why Morarth had lost her sense of body. Victor's psychedelic realm, combined with Krupus's disturbance spell, made the Green Dragon Lord completely lose the ability to struggle. Chapter 909. The rumbling sounds continued, but Charles II walked forward with a numb expression amidst the gunfire. In front of him, there were many soldiers running in panic on the road full of rubble and blood. Some of the wounded even lost their arms in their panic, but in order to escape the hellish gunfire, they still gritted their teeth and ran toward the city gate. Many people wanted to escape the city because if they continued to stay here, no one knew if the gunfire would fall on their heads. Your Majesty! With a cry of surprise, an azure magic shield appeared around Charles II's body. Then, Magister Crone, who was wearing a magic robe and holding a dark red magic staff, landed beside him. After returning from the magic conference, Crone, Scarlet, Strange, and the others went to the Dragon's Tower to learn and communicate with them. But because of this, they were also caught by Quayo as able-bodied men, and came to the front line to assist in the battle after the war broke out. The other magisters worked hard to assist in the logistics. Crone was assigned the task of resisting possible enemy attacks from the rear of the city. After all, in a situation where the enemy had not moved, most of the time they had to consider whether there were movements from other directions. Digging tunnels, night attacks on the city walls, and the like were normal for siege battles. Therefore, Crone also escaped the first round of bombardment. When he realized the seriousness of the problem, he immediately flew to help protect Charles II, but was almost hit directly by the second round of bombardment. If not for his good luck, Crone's ice shield would have been no different from a fragile wooden plank in front of the crystal cannonballs with terrifying kinetic energy. Now that he finally found Charles II, who was in a sorry state, Crone immediately came over to cast a spell to protect the monarch, but he found that the once high-spirited monarch's face was now ashen. When he looked at him, his eyes were abnormally dull. "Crone? You're here." He didn't give any orders and just continued to walk forward. Crone knew that this wasn't the way and hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, I'll escort you back to the Imperial City now. We need to find someone to gather the soldiers here. The enemy's attack is too fierce. We can't just wait for death in the city like this." "Find who?" Charles II pointed to the northern city wall that had been blown up for dozens of meters. "How many people there can continue to fight for me?" Then he patted Crone on the shoulder. "Don't worry about me for now. Go over there and help them first, however many people your spell can save." "Your Majesty." Crone could hear the deep despair in his words, but should he listen to the Emperor at this time? If they listened, Charles II might be blasted to death in the next second. If they didn't listen, wouldn't that be disobeying the orders of the monarch? "Run! Run!" Suddenly, there was a commotion behind them. The two of them turned around and saw that the west gate had been opened by the soldiers guarding the city. Countless people saw the gate open, and they all ran out like crazy. Under such circumstances, people instinctively thought that the outside of the city was safer than the inside, because there were no enemies outside, while staying inside the city could be blown to pieces at any time. In the era of cold weapons, the fear of defending a city came from the fact that the city walls were breached and the enemies entered the city. At this time, everyone was hiding in the city that they thought was safe, but they realized that they were still facing the risk of being blown up. What was even more frightening was that no one knew where the next shell would land. In a situation where they could no longer see the enemy, this fear of the unknown was far more devastating than the simple news of, "The enemy has entered the city." After the city gate opened, because there were too many people pouring out, many in the front row were trampled underfoot on the spot. They couldn't even get up before they were trampled to death by the tide of people behind them. Looking at the chaos, Charles II was even more desperate. He waved his hand. "Go save the people, don't worry about me." Just as Archmage Crone was hesitating, a circle of flames suddenly descended around him. He was startled, and upon a closer look, he realized that it was a large shield condensed from elements. The violent magic fluctuations made him turn around. Lord Quayo stood beside Charles II with a gloomy expression and said, "Follow me." This lord, who had disappeared before, had actually gone to cast a spell to protect the nobles who had not yet been blown up. He knew very well that he had to work hard to ensure the survival of these guys, so that he could continue to use them as puppets in the future. If he allowed Efta's bombardment to destroy the core layer, it would be meaningless to leave Charles II as a commander without an army. But he didn't expect that Efta's bombardment would come round after round. If he hadn't acted quickly, Charles II would have almost been blown to death on the spot. The anger in Quayo's heart continued to accumulate amidst the bombardment, but at this moment, he was still able to keep himself rational as much as possible. He raised his hand and enveloped Charles II with a shield. He directly floated into the air and brought the ladder to the tallest bell tower in the center of the city. He completely ignored Crone, who seemed to want to say something but was hesitant. The latter looked at the backs of the two figures in the distance and sighed silently. The whistling sound of the shells came again. His expression did not change as he raised his shield and flew forward. At this time, he could only choose to continue carrying out Charles II's previous order, to use magic to save the wounded as much as possible. When Charles II arrived in front of the bell tower, he was shocked to find many nobles in tattered clothes and dusty faces who had survived. "Stay inside." After saying this, Quayo turned around and flew in another direction. Charles II looked at the battered and exhausted nobles in front of him. Most of them were in the prime of their lives. Among them, a few silver-haired old nobles were also in high spirits before going into battle. But now all of them were sitting on the ground dispiritedly. Many of them were injured and were gritting their teeth to endure the pain. When they saw Charles II coming over, they did not immediately salute or shout slogans like in the past. Instead, they looked at the monarch and waited for him to say something. But how could Charles II be in the mood to encourage these nobles? They hadn't even seen the enemy's face, and a third of the entire city had been blown up. Even more than half of the assembled army had been killed or injured. Now there were even people who opened the city gates and fled outside. Anyone with a little military knowledge would understand that this battle had been lost. Charles II stood there in a daze for a long time. In the end, he didn't say anything. He slowly walked to the wall and sat on the ground without a care for his image. At this time, it was no longer important whether the dragons would take action or not. Charles II had already lost the foundation of his rule. Who would continue to listen to a commander without military strength? His behavior made the other nobles lower their head. Before anyone could express anything, the next round of bombardment resonated in the surroundings. The top of the bell tower was directly hit by a cannonball, and the impact of the explosion caused the entire top half of the bell tower to collapse. This scene caused everyone to turn pale with fright. However, Charles II sat there and did not dodge at all. He raised his head as though he was welcoming his end. But then, these falling stones were blocked outside by a barrier. Quayo let them stay here because he had released a sufficiently strong barrier in advance. Even if the bell tower was blown into ruins, these nobles were still alive and well inside the barrier. But for them, the scene around them made them even more disheartened. Looking around, the buildings of the central inner city, the city walls, and even the originally smooth streets were almost completely destroyed. After the debris of the buildings fell to the ground, they could even see many soldiers who were originally running away. But after the fierce bombardment, they even had a mental breakdown. They were kneeling on the ground, covering their faces and wailing. In this kind of war, who could say that there was a possibility of a comeback? And Queo, who was standing in the ruins, was now personally facing the fierce explosion and impact. His shield constantly flashed with orange light, blocking all the damage outside. In fact, as long as he floated more than a dozen meters above the ground, he could basically avoid these injuries. But at this moment, he was standing here, trying to accumulate the anger in his heart and find a reason to make a decision. Thinking that until now, no other dragons had appeared in this war, Queo couldn't help but feel a little regretful. Back then, when he used the space-time rift to reach a contract with those feudal lords, he didn't even consider letting them participate in this kind of war. He only told the other dragons to support the royal family's Dragon Tower teaching project. So now, in the eyes of the other dragons, the red dragons were probably a joke. Queo had to admit that Efta's combat power was completely beyond his imagination. With such a bombardment, even if 3 more members of the royal family came, they would still end up the same. But did this mean that he had to give up? In fact, Queo already had no way out. If he gave up now, it would not matter if the royal family was finished, but what about the reputation of the red dragons? How much power would they have left in the future among the dragons? What made Queo's heart palpitate even more was the strength displayed by the humans in front of him. In the view of the dragons, a war between humans was a war between ants. No matter how many humans there were, they would never be a threat to the dragons. But the continuous bombardment of the shield made Queo change his view. If it was a young dragon standing here, his fate would not be any better than the dismembered corpses beside him. And even young dragons like Iskar could also die under the attack of the crystal cannons if they were not protected in advance. In other words, the attack power possessed by humans could already threaten the dragons. It was just like Count Rice, who had rebelled in the Ifta cabinet. He did not lack food or clothing, but he tried his best to destroy Ifta's path to unification. He wanted to defend his own interests as a great lord. And now, Queo was also aware of such a crisis. The sound of the cannons stopped. He gritted his teeth and was about to leave when the roar of propellers came from the sky. After the Albatross returned to the city, it flew directly to the sky above Enrique City. Because it was a large target, it bombed at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Queo stared blankly as the plane dropped the bomb. He narrowed his eyes and watched helplessly as the huge bomb landed not far in front of him. Boom! The impact, which was far more powerful than the crystal cannons, shattered the first layer of the shield around Queo's body. Although the wall of flaming sun, which was passively activated, blocked the subsequent impact, the dragon's lord still took 2 steps back because of the terrifying shock. After the smoke and fog dispersed, a huge pit more than 3 meters deep was left on the ground. Within a radius of 20 meters, there were still no buildings standing. Only the place where Queo stood was slightly better preserved because of the wall of flaming sun. The other areas were only scorched black from the high temperature. Chapter 9-10. Queo suddenly raised his head and raised his hand to cast a flame spear into the sky. The long spear condensed from fire elements quickly drew a bright trail in the sky. The power of this lord's hateful attack was truly astonishing. But soon, the flame spear that flew from below to above began to slow down in the sky. The Albatross transport plane looked slow, but that was because of the long distance. In fact, after all the bombs were dropped, it could reach a speed of more than 250 kilometers per hour, which was not slow at all compared to land transportation. Even though Quio's spell was locked on by the spirit, the attack from below had to fight against gravity and the strong wind at high altitude. As a result, when this flame spear technique flew to an altitude of a kilometer or so, it deviated from its original flight path by a large margin. When it rose to an altitude of 2 kilometers, it had already lost its original flight speed and began to sway unstably. Although Quio was a demigod, he had not reached the point where he could ignore time and space. He had hurriedly launched this attack out of hatred and did not consider the impact of the ground to air. Thus, no matter how hard he tried to control the flame spear, it was still more than a kilometer away from the albatross due to its lack of strength. Therefore, the entire Enrique city, including the soldiers in Efta's camp, witnessed the scene of the flame spear being shaken off by the albatross. When Quio wanted to cast a second attack, the albatross had already flown far away. It flew higher and hid among the white clouds. "You will pay the price." Quio knew that there must be dragons around him who had witnessed him making a fool of himself. Finally, he could not hold back the anger in his heart and shouted this sentence with a ferocious expression. However, this angry lord did not realize that in the ruins beside him, inconspicuous vines were spreading through the cracks. The bombardment lasted until the sun set. In order to ensure the life of the crystal cannons, after the first 3 rounds, the subsequent bombardments were basically more than 40 minutes apart. But even so, there were still 6 crystal cannons that had problems. At this moment, they had been hauled by trucks back to Lannis Town, the first rear base, for maintenance. On this day, the infantrymen who were on standby in the trenches were the most bored. The most they did was to plug their ears during the bombardment. Later on, the commanding officer ordered them to continue digging trenches and bunkers. Thus, this group of soldiers experienced the boring experience of digging trenches in the middle of a decisive battle. On the other hand, the engineering company was much busier than them. When the platoon leader, Rorschach, was finally replaced, his uniform was covered in white sweat that had been left behind after his sweat had dried. This was because they had been solving various problems caused by the resonance vibration in the cannon truck workshop. After all, AFTA military was still in its infancy. These trucks were put into use after a long journey of thousands of kilometers, and it was inevitable that there would be many minor problems. Fortunately, the quality of these people in the engineering company was excellent. By nightfall, most of the problems had been solved or replaced. The barracks behind the position lit up, and the aroma of food filled the air. Rorschach could not help but swallow his saliva. Before the battle in the morning, everyone was given individual rations, so everyone had lunch in the trenches. But no one expected that the war had only been going on for a day, and everyone could still take turns to eat in the canteen at the front line. Hearing the order for the company to assemble not far away, he hung the kettle on his waist, got up, and called his soldiers to stand in line. Soon, the engineering company came to the rear camp area shouting the slogan, 1, 2, 1. They first lined up to wash their hands, then cleaned the lid of the kettle, and used it as a container to receive dinner. Dinner was mutton soup and bread with meat stuffing. The logistics staff saw Rorschach and said with a smile, "You are the busiest today. Eat more." As he spoke, he gave Rorschach 2 servings, and the latter also thanked him politely. He then realized that this was indeed preferential treatment for the engineering company because each soldier of the engineering company received more food than the infantrymen. The so-called canteen was an open space specially pulled out. There was not even a table. More than a dozen logs were placed as stools. Everyone had a place to sit and eat. It was also a rare moment of relaxation in the day. It was just that the soldiers had developed the habit of not talking during meals. Everyone sat there and listened to the chirping of the insects. They quickly swept away the food in their hands and then left under the leadership of the platoon leaders to make room for the next batch of people. "Platoon leader, Are there any missions tonight? The company commander said it's a rest night. Everyone, go back and sleep early. He took the 3 squads back to the camp. It was now free time to rest, but everyone still spoke in a low voice. After a day of bombardment, will the Royal Army attack again at night? This is not something we should think about. We are now in a state of level 1 combat readiness. Even when we rest, we have to be ready for battle. Keep your armor and weapons by your side. Got it? Got it. Platoon leader. Good. Dismissed. Go and rest. Compared to a normal army, the Eiffel camp had so many rules that it made people's hair stand on end. The most insane thing was that any soldier randomly picked from the camp could memorize these rules. With such management rules, the camp could be so orderly. Rorschach often thought about the difference between this army and the gangster-like army he knew in the past. The biggest difference he could think of now was that every soldier remembered the rules in their hearts, and under the influence of the accumulation of time, they had developed the habit of abiding by and even protecting it together. These rules made the management of the entire army extremely simple and efficient. It also gave the soldiers a sense of honor they had never felt before. As long as Rorschach saw his epaulets, he would feel an inexplicable sense of pride spread from the bottom of his heart. This was something he had never experienced before. Seeing that the soldiers under him had all returned to their dormitories, Rorschach also planned to go back to his tent to rest. But before he reached the tent, lightning flashed above his head. Thunder followed. It was the rainy season, and the soldiers were used to it. They only complained that such weather would make the trenches muddy. Rorschach looked up and suddenly found something wrong. In his field of vision, dense raindrops had begun to fall, but he could not hear the expected sound of the raindrops falling. The others also noticed this and ran out to take a look. It did not take long for them to realize that there was a magic array blocking the downpour outside for them. The constant flashes of lightning allowed them to see the invisible barrier above their heads blocking the rain. The barrier was so large that it not only covered the entire camp but also the trenches in front of them. Rorschach was a little stunned because he remembered that it had rained when he was in Lannistown. But why was there no such barrier at that time? But it was better than nothing. Everyone just took it as Sir Sautelar's preparations to ensure their safety and went back to sleep happily. In the city of Enrique, the heavy rain made the wounded under the ruins suffer even more. Charles II and the nobles had moved to a tavern in the city to rest. This was one of the few buildings that had not been completely destroyed. Except for more than half of the second floor that had been blown away by the impact, the main stone structure of the first floor was still there. The tavern owner had prepared meals for these nobles and emperors, but the atmosphere of their meal was similar to that of a funeral. The rooms on the second floor were basically destroyed, and these nobles could only barely sleep on the floor on the first floor. At night, the heavy rain poured down, and the leaking water made people wet and uncomfortable. Charles II took the lead in plugging the leaking floor on the second floor, but in the end, only they knew how many people fell asleep. The next morning, when the ashen-faced Charles II sat up, he suddenly heard a strange hiss. He rubbed his neck, which was a little stiff, and stepped out of the house. The door of the house had actually been shaken down in the bombing, and now it was simply left open. He reached out to push it, and the door fell to the ground with a bang. The dazzling sunlight made Charles II squint his eyes. He raised his head with 2 dark circles under his eyes, but he suddenly froze in place. In the sky in his field of vision, there were huge red figures hovering. Dragons! It's dragons! A noble behind him suddenly shouted. These old fellows immediately broke away from their dejected state and walked out of the tavern one by one, stepping on the puddles and mud. Charles II was escorted out, and only then did he realize that there were far more dragons in the sky than he had just seen. Looking around, there were nearly 100 of these crimson dragons, more than 10 meters long and with huge fangs. The dragons are finally making their move. Chapter 9:11. Charles II murmured in a low voice, but he was no longer in the mood to rejoice. The dragons came too late. Even if they won this war, he would no longer have the same ruling power over the nobles as before. The nobles around him no longer had much respect for Charles II, because this monarch was now completely a commander without an army. If Queo had not reserved his attitude toward him, it was not impossible for these great nobles to accidentally kill him last night. The desire for power was terrible. Those who could sit in the position of great nobles were not easy to deal with. The dragons in front of them were flying around the city. They seemed to be very irascible, and some of them even started to bite their companions in the air. However, this small conflict was soon interrupted by a huge figure that spread its wings in the sky above the city center. Lord Queo revealed his true form. As the chief of the Red Dragons, his body was more than 10 times larger than the dragon fledglings that were more than 10 meters long. The dragon horns on top of his head seemed to be leaping with clusters of orange flames because of the concentration of fire elements. After a dragon's roar resounded through the sky, the dragon fledglings that were still flying around immediately began to descend and gathered around Queo. This unreserved aura made Charles II and the others tremble. Even though they were hundreds of meters away, some of them still could not control their trembling bodies and fell to the ground. Queo did not care about their current state. This Red Dragon Lord looked at Iskar and the dozen or so Red Dragons who were helping to manage the dragon fledglings in the distance and said, "The weapons of those humans are so powerful that they can threaten the dragons. The power they have is beyond their control. This war is no longer a simple war of conquest. If we do not stop them today, not only the Red Dragons, but the other dragons may also be restricted and threatened in the future." The dragon language rumbled like dull thunder. The dragon fledglings could not understand what these words meant. Because of their low intelligence, they could only understand the simplest commands. These words seemed to be for Iskar and the others, but in fact, Queo was explaining to the other dragons who were hiding somewhere. "Lord, are we going to attack the humans?" Iskar's body was smaller than Queo's, and he looked a little thin in comparison. However, his problem was also what the other Red Dragons were concerned about. Attacking humans was something that had never happened before, especially when they were currently controlling the abnormally irascible infant dragon legion. These dragon fledglings were not obedient babies. They were basically one of the creatures at the top of the food chain in the entire continent. They were extremely capable of hunting and destroying. Logically speaking, they were all powerful creatures that lived alone. However, after forcefully forming a group, although they were an army in name, the discipline of these young dragons was completely controlled by the dozen or so Red Dragon members. However, if a battle really broke out, the crazed young dragons would not care about anything. Although they had been trained for a long time and would no longer target their own kind, if they were to really attack Efta's camp, the final outcome would be like a locust swarm that would kill until not a single person was left alive. Of course, Queo knew that this would be the result, so he said, "We don't need to attack. We just need the army to hover in the sky and exert pressure on them. I will personally negotiate with the leader of the enemy's army. All you need to do is to ensure that the fledgling Dragon Legion does not fall into the enemy's territory." These words made Iskar heave a sigh of relief. As a Red Dragon, he naturally had to obey orders. However, seeing that the royal family had suffered a crushing defeat, this young dragon who had been betrothed was actually overjoyed. Charles II was already a cripple. Even if the Lord made ready retreat in this war, the royal family's forces were no longer suitable to be Queo's puppet. Lord Queo would no longer look for her to marry him when he was trying to nurture a new puppet. "Yes, Lord." He readily agreed. The dragons around him also heaved a sigh of relief. After all, they also knew that the dragons could not really fight directly. Right now, they were only pretending to attack. On the surface, they said that they were patrolling. It was enough to fool the other dragons. This was indeed the only suitable plan at the moment. Otherwise, if Quio went alone to negotiate with the enemy, it would really be like compromising, and would not be good for the reputation of the dragons. After the plan was decided, it would take some time to implement it. Iskar and the other dragons first had to let these dragon fledglings take off, and then order them to fly with them. Just to do this, they were busy for more than 10 minutes. The messy dragon fledglings flew up like enlarged ducks and geese. Under the reprimand of the adult red dragons, they began to circle and move toward the Ifta camp 2 kilometers away. For the dragons who could fly, 2 kilometers was really a distance that could be covered with a flap of their wings. However, Quio was not doing this to attack. He wanted to put pressure on the Ifta commander. So, he ordered Iskar to circle around him with the dragon fledglings while he transformed into his human form and slowly flew forward in the air. Hundreds of dragon fledglings flew together like a huge dark cloud. With this momentum, he went straight to the center of the Ifta camp. As a result, he had only flown halfway when a green shadow appeared in the sky. Quio narrowed his eyes and found that the green dragon in human form in front of him was Lord Morales. The latter frowned and said bluntly, "Quio, what are you trying to do?" She was still wearing the long dress made of vines, but this time, she held a wooden staff in her hand and wore a crown made of red petals on her head. This kind of image often meant that the Lord was fully armed. After all, although dragons did not like to use weapons, it did not mean that they would reject powerful magic tools. "I just want to talk to the other party, Morales. Don't be so nervous." Of course, Quio had to use this kind of high-sounding reason. He glanced at the other party's wooden staff and said, "Although I don't know why you want to leave the Alliance, as long as you are willing to come back, I am willing to accept you at any time. And I will still give you the space-time crack that I promised you." Morales narrowed her eyes and did not answer immediately. She looked around. The crimson dragons of the fledgling Dragon Legion were roaring and flying in the sky. These bad-tempered guys had no time to calm down. Even when they were moving, they would still collide with each other. If it were not for Iskar and the others, the situation would definitely be a lot more chaotic. Turning her gaze back to the front, Morales snorted at Quio's words. She said bluntly, "The situation has already reached this point. Do you still think that you are the so-called leader of the Alliance? If the current behavior is decided by the Dragon's Alliance, then I would like to ask, why is there no one else around? Where are Victor, Krupus, and Pocatos? Even if they do not come, it should not be difficult to send a junior to help, right?" This was, of course, a direct provocation. Quio frowned and clenched his fists, trying to suppress the irritation and impatience in his heart. They did not object either. "Besides, I am only going to talk to them. I did not do anything else. You do not have to worry too much. Of course, if you are worried, you can come with me. There is nothing for me to worry about when it comes to you. Since you, as the Lord, said that you will not attack, I will naturally not doubt you. But I advise you to recognize the situation. If you continue to act willfully, I am afraid that the consequences will be very serious." Morales came alone, but she completely ignored the dragon fledglings who were trying to get close. This was naturally the confidence of a lord. However, Quio did not think much of the Green Dragon clan. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I can see the situation clearly. I do not need you to teach me." After saying that, he continued to move forward. It seemed that he intended to completely ignore Morales. Naturally, Morales would not let him leave so easily. She caught up with Quio in the air and said, "What you are doing is not only testing everyone's patience, but also looking for trouble for yourself. Humans are no longer as fragile as you think, Quio. It is not too late to change your mind. patience? Where is their patience? If you have the patience, you can come out and persuade me now. Quio glanced around. Apart from the dragon fledglings, there were obviously no other dragons around. But you, Morales, you left without saying goodbye. Now you are standing out to persuade me. What is your purpose? Could it be that you have secretly reached an agreement with the humans of EFTA? Or do you want to go against us? This kind of questioning was a bit tit-for-tat, but Morales did not deny it. She said bluntly, "You don't have to say us. Think about it carefully. If there were no dragons behind them, how could this army wipe out all the other armies so quickly and violently?" Quio's pupils shrank when he heard this. He had indeed guessed it before. How could a normal army have such strong logistics? How could they develop such powerful weapons? If there were other dragons behind them, all the doubts seemed to have a reasonable explanation. But who was supporting him? The Red Dragon Lord stared at Morales. The latter's face was full of ridicule. Just withdraw from this battle. Quio, giving up now is the choice with the least loss. In fact, you have already judged the situation in your heart, haven't you? Don't forget what the ultimate goal of the dragons is. What is the point of us fighting each other on such a small chessboard? The purpose of roping in the humans was to fight against the possible invasion of the demons, but no one knew how long it would take. But the more it was so, the more Quio could not give up the situation in front of him. He was very clear that he had to grit his teeth and get through this hurdle. Once he gave up, the Red Dragon's authority in the dragons would greatly decline. By that time, let alone the Dragons' Alliance, it would be a good thing if they did not fight each other. There are gatherings over the weekend. The update time is uncertain. Please forgive me. Chapter 9:12. I don't need your kind advice. Morales, you can stay at the side. Quio's mood had obviously become impatient, and the surrounding elements had also become restless. Quio was stronger than Morales in terms of strength. At first, he did not take Morales seriously. After all, Morales had been sleeping in the forest for so many years. Who would have thought that after they formed an alliance, Morales would be the first to break the balance and stand up to stop him? What drove her to do this? Quio narrowed his eyes. How about this? I invite you to go down with me to talk to him. You can be a witness. How about it? Don't think that this can cover up your purpose, Quio. Take your legion and leave. Let the humans solve their own problems. Haven't you noticed? EFTA's commander has been guarding against you. What do you think you can do in front of him? Morales' words made Quio laugh. Their weapons are very powerful, but they can only be used to deal with fixed targets. They can't deal with the dragons, and they can't deal with my fledgling legion. Quio's face turned cold. But you, Morales, you have to understand your situation before you say such things to me. This was a subtle threat. His words seemed to have made the fledgling dragons nearby excited. Some of them intentionally or unintentionally flew close to Quio. At the same time, they flew in front of Morales in a slightly provocative manner. This behavior and words obviously made the Green Dragon Lord's face turn ugly. Just as she was about to say something, a fledgling dragon flew over her head again. Didn't you teach them the most basic manners? Morales shouted and swung the wooden staff in his hand. A green ribbon of light extended like a whip for 70 to 80 meters in an instant and directly caught up with the fledgling dragon that had not yet flown far away. The front end of the ribbon of light directly tied the two hind legs of the fledgling dragon. As Morales swung the wooden staff horizontally, the fledgling dragon that was more than 10 meters long was thrown to the ground like a swatted fly. After flying for hundreds of meters, it spread its wings in the last few seconds before it landed, but because it was not slow enough, it smashed into the ground. Morales. Quail wanted to stop her, but it was too late. He had expected that the fledgling dragon legion would not be easy to control. If he had been the one being provoked like this, he would have gotten angry as well. But now was really not the right time to get angry. In order to cultivate combat power, the young dragons of the red dragon race were far more hot-tempered and violent than the young dragons of other dragons. They were like a bunch of unstable elements. If the pressure wasn't enough, there would immediately be an intense backlash. At this time, when one of the fledglings was suddenly attacked by morals, all the other fledglings reflexively entered battle mode. They began to accelerate and targeted morals. "Control them!" Queel immediately shouted at Iskar and the others. He didn't have time to explain to Morales. He just said loudly, "If you don't want to fight, then quickly leave this place." The Green Dragon Lord seemed to have realized this. It wasn't that she couldn't fight against these fledglings, but there was no need to do so in front of Queel. So, without saying anything, Morals flew straight up and disappeared into the sky like a green light, leaving the fledglings behind. Iskar and the others kept using dragon roars to drive the fledglings back. Most of the fledglings were quite obedient. When they found that they couldn't catch up to Morals, they flew back resentfully. But at this moment, everyone had forgotten about the fledglings that Morals had just thrown to the ground. This fledglings landed in front of Averta's camp. Because it had spread its wings before landing, it didn't suffer any serious injuries. But after being slapped away, its anger didn't diminish. After getting up, this fledglings instinctively looked around. When it realized that there were hundreds of eyes staring at it from the ditches in front of it, this fledglings that had never come into contact with humans immediately regarded them as creatures that could threaten it. Without saying anything, it opened its mouth wide, roar. Fierce flames shot out in an instant, causing Queel, who was still standing in the sky, to widen his eyes. He never thought that his fledglings would actually launch an attack like this. With this mouthful of flames, regardless of whether there were any casualties or not, the news of dragons attacking Averta's soldiers would probably be confirmed. Logically speaking, this would never happen. Before he set off, he had specifically instructed Iskar and the others that the fledglings could not land on the ground and had to hover at a height of more than 500 meters. At the same time, he had repeatedly given a death order. They must never take the initiative to attack the ground units. But who would have thought that Morals would be provoked by the fledglings and be thrown to the ground directly? The fledgling's breath was not as corrosive as the adult dragon's breath. It was just pure flames. It opened its mouth and shot out a column of fire that was more than 10 meters long. As a result, the flames hit the slope, but it did not hurt the Averta soldiers at all. These infantrymen had long hidden in the trenches before the fledglings opened their mouths. The trenches were high in the front and low in the back, allowing the flames to pass over their heads. Other than feeling some heat on their backs, the soldiers were unharmed. At the same time, there was a cacophony of commands. The first to react were the archers at the back. The 2 rows of archers would never miss their target at this distance, but the problem was that they did not know where to shoot when faced with the huge size of the fledglings. So, they simply relied on their instincts and aimed at the chest, which had the largest surface area. The sound of crossbow strings slicing through the air could be heard. The fledglings, who had opened their mouth to spit fire for the second time, were hit by 70 to 80 arrows on the spot. Most of the crossbow bolts hit its neck and chest, but the defensive power of the dragon scales was strong. Among so many crossbow bolts, only 2 or 3 had nailed into the gap between the scales because of the coincidental angle. The rest were all blocked outside. It was expected that the arrows would be ineffective, but the 7 or 8 mages at the front were not going to be polite. When the fledglings were completely aroused by the arrows, their control spells began to fall on the body of the fledglings in batches. The dragon scales were highly resistant to spells, so most of the spells that were thrown at it were negated. However, there were still 1 or 2 ice spells that slowed the fledglings down, causing it to be unable to rush to the front of the trenches and bite the fledglings. When the fledgling struggled to shake its head to free itself from the influence of the spells, the cannoneers at the back had already completed their aim. Previously, the attacks on Enrique City had been carried out by the double-barreled heavy cannons. But to deal with a target that was about 100 meters long and as large as the fledglings, the cannoneers operating the small-caliber crystal cannons were the fastest and most accurate choice. After the 6 crystal cannons shouted the signal of "ready," the company commander at the front immediately made a gesture of permission, "fire." The cannons sounded almost at the same time, causing Quio, who was in the sky, to widen his eyes. In the next moment, the fledglings that had just broken free from the control of the spells fell to the ground as if they had been hit by an invisible hammer. The small-caliber crystal cannons were equally powerful. 3 of the 6 cannonballs hit its body, and the powerful kinetic energy caused countless dragon scales to burst open on the spot. If not for the fact that solid bullets were used, the fledglings would have been blown to pieces on the spot. The bullets were embedded in the fledgling's body after hitting it, and this was only from the small-caliber crystal cannons. If the large-caliber double-barreled crystal cannons had been used just now, the fledgling's carcass would probably have been difficult to piece together. The power of Ifurta's weapon was undoubtedly demonstrated at this moment. The soldiers who were originally trembling in fear when facing the countless dragons in the trenches could not help but cheer at this moment. They finally realized that the so-called dragons were not as invincible as they had imagined. The arrows could not penetrate it? 1 round of cannon fire was enough. The fledglings that were lying on the ground hissed and wanted to get up, but the intense pain made it feel boundless fear. Since its birth, this fledglings had never encountered such a fierce attack. Most importantly, it did not know who had attacked it. The fledglings could only see a large ravine. It did not know what a crystal cannon was at all. Quio had been bombarded by crystal cannons and bombs before, so he had some expectations of the power of Ifurta's weapon. But when the Red Dragon Clan's fledglings really fell in front of the battlefield, he finally felt the uneasiness that was buried in his heart. Humans were no longer afraid of dragons. Seeing that his own kind had been defeated, he was angry, but more than that, he felt an involuntary coldness. His original plans had been disrupted. At this moment, the dragons and Ifurta had already started firing at each other. What should he do? Should he continue negotiating or, a bold idea emerged from the bottom of Quio's heart. Since Ifurta had attacked and seriously injured a fledglings, if he used this as an excuse to open fire, the other dragons would most likely lose the reason to blame him, right? At this moment, Quio's ambition had caused his way of thinking to no longer be as calm as before. He ignored the reason for Roddy's attack and only thought about the other party's firepower that could even deal with the dragons. In his mind, the level of this war was no longer limited to humans, but was closely related to the dragon's ability to dominate humans. While he was thinking, the fledglings next to him did not think about this. After seeing their companions groaning in pain on the ground, they immediately ignored the control of Iskar and the others and began to forcefully dive down. More than 10 dragons desperately shouted at the fledglings who intended to dive down and attack the battlefield. However, only the fledglings that were close to them were barely obedient. The fledglings that were further away simply ignored these orders and swooped down from a distance of hundreds of meters in just a few seconds. Seeing this situation, Quio simply raised his hand to cast a signal spell. For all the fledglings, this red trail across the sky meant a horn for an all-out attack. At this moment, the nearly 10,000 soldiers in Ifurta's camp were completely facing the attack of the entire fledglings legion. Chapter 9:13. Get down. Get down quickly. Protect yourself with all your might. The platoon leader's voice echoed in the narrow trench. Soldier Bucky immediately lay down on the right side after hearing this, and then covered his upper body with the round shield in his hand. These trenches, which were more than 1.5 meters deep and less than 1 meter wide, were dug by themselves. Therefore, it was difficult for external attacks to harm the soldiers in the trench when they lay down. Bucky's mouth was full of the smell of mud. Just now, the young dragon's flame had streaked across the trench. The hot temperature made his helmet feel a little hot, but other than that, there was no other effect. West, who was beside him, was facing his head. At this moment, the position was abnormally quiet. They did not know what was happening above their heads. West pondered for a long time and could not help but ask, "Do you think we can defeat these dragons?" Both of them were lying down with their helmets on, so their voices were muffled. "I don't know how many have come?" Bucky was also a little nervous. After all, the feeling of more than 100 giant dragons hovering above his head was not good. "Let me see," West said as he tried to turn his helmet sideways. He looked at the long sky above the trench and exclaimed, "Damn it! They're all starting to dive." Before he could finish speaking, he was slapped on his helmet by Bucky from behind. "Keep your voice down." Those words were considered to disturb the morale of the troops. If the platoon leader caught him, he would definitely be punished. However, Bucky was also curious about how many giant dragons there were. He twisted his body, used the shield in front of his face, and looked through the gap in his helmet. Due to the haste of the orders, the young dragons were roughly divided into two groups. There were more than 20 young dragons that did not listen to the command and dived first. They were approaching Ifta's position. The large army that followed behind them barely formed a V-shaped formation. The giant dragons' diving power was astonishing. Just looking at their wingspans of more than 10 meters was enough to make people feel afraid. But just as these 20-plus dragon fledglings rushed to the vicinity of Ifta's camp, they seemed to have suddenly hit an invisible wall, and each of them suffered a violent impact with a bam. The dull sound caused Bucky's helmet to buzz. His vision was narrow, and he could only see one or two of the dragons tilting their necks and falling directly towards him. That was a true fall, because the impact at the speed of a dive was fatal to the fledglings. Among the 23 fledglings, 18 of them had their necks broken on the spot. The body controlled by the severed nerves could no longer flap its wings. The huge dragon body swayed and rolled on the ground. Bang! Bucky's body was jolted by the violent vibration. Before he could react to what had happened, a large amount of mud and dust rained down from the top of the trench. Fortunately, he used his shield to block his face. Otherwise, he would have choked to death. After the movement disappeared, Bucky found himself almost unable to move under the weight of the earth and stones. When West pushed the shield away with him, the two of them had to sit up to ensure that they could breathe smoothly. However, Bucky, who was spitting out the sand in his mouth, was startled by the huge dragon head in front of him. The dead young dragon created a pit in the ground, and its body drew a long mark on the ground. At this moment it covered a trench next to it. However, because the trench was deep, there were no casualties among the soldiers lying down. Only a few were buried in the soil, and at this moment they were climbing out with the help of their comrade. The young dragon's neck had been broken, and the bones poked out of its skin. Red blood seeped into the ground. Its huge mouth full of sharp teeth was slightly open. Judging from its size, swallowing Bucky's body would be easy. However, the other party was just a pile of rotten flesh. Bucky turned his head and suddenly realized that there was a huge barrier in the sky. The subsequent young dragons were trying to dodge to the side in an attempt to avoid this barrier, but there were still many who did not turn in time and hit it with a bang. Then, they fell to the ground not far away with a wail. But just as this earth-shattering battle broke out, Bucky reached out and touched his helmet, because he suddenly felt a cold aura spreading, but looking around, there were no signs of ice spells appearing on the battlefield. What's going on? At this moment, in the sky, the young dragons realized the existence of the barrier and began to spit fire at the outer barrier. Bucky looked to the other side and indifferently found that a huge thing had appeared in the center of the camp. The huge and dark magic tower tore apart the original camouflage. Its appearance was completely out of the expectations of the Ifta infantrymen. Because they had been stationed here for more than a week, from the beginning of the construction of the camp until now, no one had realized that there was such a huge magic tower beside them. This scene made Bucky's breathing a little hurried. The original fear of the attack of hundreds of giant dragons had suddenly dissipated with the light at the top of the magic tower. 12 rays of light shot out and accurately hit the 12 young dragons close to the barrier. The latter's wings were pierced on the spot, and some were even broken. They howled and fell into the air, and most of them inevitably hit the barrier. Then, they screamed and fell to the ground, and after a muffled sound, there was no more sound, the defensive barrier and energy impact from the Grand Arcanist Edith. In just a short span of half a minute, let Quio experience the calmness she had when she faced the dragons. In an instant, more than a quarter of the infant dragon legion, which numbered nearly 100, had been lost. This scene made Quio furious. He raised his hand, intending to cast a spell attack. However, after thinking about it, he stopped. The current situation could be said to be Ifta attacking the infant dragon legion. If the infant dragon legion were to solve the problem later on, it would be excusable for the other dragons. However, if he, the Lord, personally solved the problem, it would be hard to say. This kind of restriction made Quio feel aggrieved. What gave him a headache was the sudden appearance of the magic tower. The opponent's camouflage ability made him not realize it from the beginning to the end. This meant that the level of the sorcerer in the magic tower might be similar to his. The series of attacks just now was clean and decisive, and he suddenly felt a vague sense of familiarity. Damn it! Could it be that tower? Quio suddenly realized the identity of this magic tower. However, the information in his mind was too absurd. How could the magic tower from more than 700 years ago suddenly appear here? In the past, the dragons had once clashed with the High Elf Grand Arcanist. In the end, the High Elf Grand Arcanist used the magic tower to utterly defeat them and escape. This was an event that the dragons had tried their best to avoid mentioning in the history of the dragons. Even a young member of the dragon race like Iskar didn't know about this matter, but Quio remembered that the demonic tower in that incident was exactly the same as the one in front of him. His original thought of restraining himself from attacking was immediately dispelled. In Quio's eyes, Ifta's strength had increased again and again. At this time, it had reached a point where he had no choice but to attack. However, the sudden dragon roars from both sides made him stop abruptly. Quio looked over and saw a large green figure flying rapidly towards him. He immediately saw Morelos, who had just left. This meant that the green dragons were indeed planning to intervene in this battle. She also brought along a green-scaled fledgling along with her. At the same time, there were more than 20 giant dragons in her clan. The moment he saw them, Quio knew that it would be difficult for him to achieve his goal in this attack. However, the corpse of the fledgling was still there. Could he really leave with his tail between his legs? Thinking of this, he spread his arms and directly transformed into his giant dragon form, descending to the ground. When he approached the huge barrier, Quio did not move at all. He completely relied on his huge momentum and the condensed elements in the surroundings to smash the transparent barrier into pieces like a huge meteorite. Edith, who was inside the magic tower, did not fight head-on with her opponent. The moment the barrier was smashed, she immediately closed the air defense barrier to prevent the intense consumption of the crystals in the magic tower. Quio's huge figure landed on the ground with a loud bang. His momentum was far more terrifying than the previous fledgling dragons. The furious Quio spread his wings, and the demigod aura of the dragon's lord suddenly erupted. A hurricane immediately blew up in the artillery position. The sand and gravel on the battlefield poured into the trenches, and the soldiers who were covering their heads with their hands were now covered with a layer of soil. The trucks in front of the magic tower that carried the giant cannons shook violently in the wind. If it were not for the sturdy chassis and its huge weight, perhaps the trucks would have overturned on the spot. Iskar and the others were a little hesitant. They did not know what was going to happen next. However, the remaining fledgling dragons did not care about this. They circled around and tried to approach the magic tower. However, once they were within 200 meters of the tower, the sudden burst of light would accurately hit them. Screams and hisses resounded throughout the battlefield. However, no matter how close the fledgling dragons got, the magic tower's counterattack was unusually firm. It seemed to not care about Quio, who was standing at the side. At the same time, 3 figures appeared on the prototype platform at the top of the magic tower. I went out for a party and went to sleep. When I woke up, it was already dark. When I was organizing the updates, I discovered that the draft was different from what I remembered. Every time I wrote it, I had to revise the details several times to ensure that the clues were complete. In the end, it seemed that the revised document was not saved. This version was the earliest one. So, after revising it for a long time, the number of updates was also lower. The climax of the plot is the area where the foreshadowing will be concentrated. I will try my best to make sure that there are no mistakes. Chapter 9:14. Roddy, who was clad in leather armor, had a blue short sword at his waist. He looked at Quio calmly. Sally, who was holding a scepter in her hand, was clad in a luxurious purple duke robe. She even had a gorgeous crystal crown on her head. The daughter of Duke, who was once ignored by everyone, was now firmly standing on the stage of the kingdom of Karen. No one could question her right now. Behind her, the high elf Grand Arcanist Edith stood at the center of the tower. She looked up with her calm eyes. The approaching dragons were like annoying flies. As she looked away, the intruders were immediately hit by the beam of light. Not a single one of them was missed. Lord Quio, do you intend to participate in the war between me and Charles II? Roddy's voice, amplified by the sound amplification spell, echoed across the battlefield. Facing the Lord of the Dragons, there was even a hint of mockery in his words. Roddy, you have hurt my people. Be prepared to bear the wrath of the red dragons. I will not let you go. The green dragons were approaching. In order to find a valid excuse for himself to attack, Quio's first sentence was a typical accusation. Quio did not mention the fact that he had brought the fledgling dragon legion to suppress them. Instead, he insisted that Roddy had killed the red dragon. Although it sounded unfair, it was enough for the collective dragon race. After all, be it the red dragons or the other dragons, humans were not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as them. Quio spoke in Bringen. His voice rumbled, and all the Iferta soldiers on the battlefield could hear him clearly. They could not help but panic. Hearing a Lord of the Dragons threaten the Iferta Prime Minister with their own ears, this feeling was completely different from the usual gossip and speculation. No matter what had happened before, the fear of the dragons was buried in the hearts of most people. However, Roddy's response was straightforward. He took a step forward and stood on the edge of the platform of the Helsinki Magic Tower. He said, "What else can the Red Dragon do besides standing in the back and playing dirty tricks? You even have to find such a despicable excuse for a head-on battle. You can't even compare to the puppet Charles II that you supported. If you want to fight, just say it. There's no need for so much nonsense." The voice amplification technique silenced the battlefield. It was the first time many soldiers had heard Prime Minister Efter's voice. Although it was not convenient for them to get up and observe the Prime Minister's current image, his words suddenly gave everyone an indescribable courage. At the same time, the heavy weight of the word dragons in his heart seemed to lighten a lot. Throughout the history of mankind, when had anyone ever talked to a Lord of Dragons like this? This moment was epical for both the humans and the dragon clan. Quio frowned. Roddy's reaction was beyond his imagination. Although he had the strength of a demigod and was not afraid of this magic tower, Roddy's words were obviously fearless. Looking at the green dragon that was about to arrive on the battlefield, Quio immediately determined that the one standing behind Roddy must be Morales. Thinking of this, he did not waste any more words. He took a step forward, and a huge red pattern with a diameter of more than 100 meters appeared on the ground under his feet. The next moment, the entire battlefield was instantly enveloped by the scorching breath from the volcano. The originally clear sky had also taken on a strange red hue. Quio raised his huge dragon claws and waved them toward the magic tower. 3 tornadoes made of burning flames began to move toward the magic tower. They were small tornadoes with a diameter of 5 or 6 meters at first, but after moving 5 or 6 meters, they rapidly expanded and became tornadoes that seemed to destroy the entire battlefield. But before the storm could affect the front line, a dark green barrier enveloped the entire battlefield from top to bottom. Morales made her move. Quio, who was a demigod, had activated his volcano domain, while Morales used his nature's heart domain to forcibly block his spell. In the domain, each demigod could exert several times more power than usual, and when the domains collided, it was the time for the 2 lords to compete in strength. But Morales did not come alone. She had brought along 15 members of her clan and more than 50 dragon whelps. Therefore, when these green dragons directly cut into the battlefield, the elemental collision immediately caused a large-scale explosion. However, the violent impact was completely blocked by the magic tower shield enchantment that Edith raised his hand to cast. The 3 flame tornadoes dissipated on the spot under Morales' domain. Immediately after, the huge figure of the Green Dragon Lord flew above the front line. Her dragon roar echoed throughout the battlefield. "Quio! You have crossed the line!" Along with her words, 7 or 8 red dragon whelps were directly hit by the blooming green light. Large barbed vines quickly spread on the surface of their bodies that were originally flying in the air. These dragon whelps were frightened and desperately flapped their wings to struggle. But every time their wings contracted, the vines tightened like hunting pythons. In the end, these dragon whelps were tightly tied up like dumplings and directly fell to the ground. The green fledgling dragon and the red fledgling dragon also pounced and bit at each other. The green dragon members also didn't waste any time casting nature spells, continuously attacking the red fledgling dragon that flew past them. They even attacked Iska and the others. Quio did not expect Morales to be so heavy-handed. The green dragons and red dragons did not have many interactions, so even if Morales tried to dissuade them, she should have stopped and talked. How could she be so unyielding and kill them? The fledgling Dragon Legion had already lost 30% of its members. Now that they had charged in, nearly half of them had lost the ability to fight. Quio's anger had been accumulating for a long time. Seeing such an unreasonable attack from Morales, he did not say a word and flapped his wings. Hundreds of flame spears condensed in the air and spread out in a fan shape. The green dragon whelps that were pierced on the spot screamed and fell to the ground. There were even adult green dragons that had their wings pierced and dodged to the side in pain. As soon as he finished casting the spell, he was hit in the chest by a large green light from Morales. "Haven't you realized it yet? No one is standing on the red dragon's side now." Just as Morales finished speaking, Quio's even more violent power swept over. The red flames that were like magma devoured all the green. Boom! It was as if the whole sky was burning. "I don't need anyone's help." Morales, who was surrounded by the red light, was struggling to hold on by relying on the spherical shield. However, Quio's huge body had already risen into the air. His huge dragon claws directly smashed her shield and smashed into the green dragon's chest in the splashing magma. The sound of the heavy blow could be heard clearly throughout the battlefield. After that, Quio's second attack came. "Burn, son of flame!" The sky, which was originally red, was completely ignited with bright yellow flames. The red fledglings that had been fighting hard with the green dragons started to burn. Their scales started to turn black, but their speed and strength became stronger. The red dragons, who had undergone training, were slightly stronger than the green fledglings that had been gathered at the last minute. At this moment, they had an overwhelming advantage. The whole battlefield had completely fallen into a white-hot battle. However, Efta, who was originally the protagonist, had now become a bystander under the protection of the magic tower. "Your Excellency Morales, why are you doing this?" In the air, Roddy's voice was quickly covered by the sound of the two lords fighting. However, it was obvious that Morales' behavior was beyond his expectations. It was just that at this time, the Green Dragon Lord did not answer. After being hit by Quio, Morales, who suddenly grew another 2 pairs of wings, suddenly broke away from the battle and rushed towards the red whelps that were crazily biting the green dragons at an even faster speed. Quio knew that she was trying to avoid the fight, so he flapped his wings and chased after her. However, he found that her speed was as fast as green lightning. In the blink of an eye, she had already collided with 5 or 6 whelps in the air. She then adjusted her flight direction flexibly and quickly helped the green dragons regain their advantage. A battle between demigods was naturally not just a physical battle on the surface. Seeing her like this, Quio decided not to chase after her. Instead, he stopped and chanted a draconic spell in a low voice. An elemental whirlpool suddenly appeared in the sky above his head. This was the sign of a powerful forbidden spell. Quio's wings stopped flapping, and he hovered in the air solely by relying on his magic power. His fiery red eyes stared at Morelos below the battlefield. The soldiers in the trenches were completely stunned by the scene in front of them. Many people would not see dragons even once in their lifetime, but at this moment, they were witnessing a scene where more than 200 dragons were fighting and killing each other. From afar, this scene was enough to be called spectacular. However, when the soldiers were below the battlefield where the dragons were fighting, they could only feel endless shock and fear. Every dragon that fell was like a meteorite that smashed a shocking hole in the ground. At the same time, any of the skills of the two lords were cast, and the sweeping elemental impact caused the ground to suffer an unimaginable impact. At this moment, the soldier Baki tried his best to curl up and hide his whole body under the shield. He covered his ears tightly with both hands, but he could not stop the violent roars from piercing into his brain. Wester, who was beside him, was no longer in the mood to chat with him. Almost all the soldiers in the trenches were in the same posture. No one knew when this battle would end. They could only hope that the dragons in the sky would not fall on them. However, as they listened to the muffled roars, the sky in their field of vision was like the judgment day of the gods depicted in an oil painting. It made them feel powerless and insignificant. Chapter 9:15. The flying Morales no longer looked like a normal dragon. With 6 wings, she mimicked a giant insect in the forest known as the Tefla dragonfly. The 6 pairs of wings greatly improved her flying ability. With the blessing of the nature's heart, Morales also had the ability to become invisible. When she flew at her fastest speed, her figure in the domain would disappear from the sight of most creatures. Even an elite red dragons like Iskar could not block her attack. His shield was shattered, and he was sent flying by a palm strike. Then, he was entangled by the vines and fell to the ground. Needless to say, the power displayed by Morales was not as violent and powerful as Quio's, but it was extremely efficient. She did not pursue extreme damage, but she used the fastest method to make more than 20 dragons lose their combat power. When she looked back at Quio, who was still chanting a spell, her expression was meaningful. However, when she glanced at Roddy's expression, she found that Roddy did not look anxious at all. Instead, His face was unusually calm, as if he had expected everything in front of him to happen. This feeling made Morales feel uneasy. She recalled the whole process of her conversation with Roddy and thought about what he had just said. She could not imagine how a human could remain calm in such a situation. Was it because of the magic tower? In fact, Morales had long seen that the magic tower was strong in appearance but weak in reality. It could only attack and control targets within the range of the enchantment. Against the young dragons further away, it could only stare at them helplessly. And the mage who controlled the magic tower did not have a real body at all. How could a mage who existed purely in the state of a soul fight against a real dragon's lord? Quayo's spell gradually came to an end. The clouds in the sky had been rolled into a ring by the elemental vortex. Bright orange light appeared around his body, and the blazing temperature had distorted the air. Quayo's forbidden spell was not a directional spell, but a buff that strengthened his overall body, burning blood. It was called a forbidden spell not only because it was powerful. In fact, the power of any spell cast by a demigod dragon's lord was immeasurable. The strength of burning blood was that it did not simply condense elemental power. Instead, it used Quayo's own dragon blood as the price to give himself unparalleled flying and close combat abilities for a period of time. In other words, this was a powerful spell used for one-on-one duels. Efta's magic tower was not a threat in his eyes, but the strange Morales was. A large amount of blood flowed out from the gaps of his scales. Quayo raised his head and roared. Amidst the deafening dragon roar, the blood instantly disappeared into the surrounding light. The next moment, Quayo's figure suddenly rushed out. He did not even have the time to flap his wings. Morales, who was dodging at high speed, spiraled upwards to avoid his pursuit. However, Quayo, who had activated the forbidden spell, was too fast. He was like a second sun streaking across the sky. With a dazzling light, he crossed the entire battlefield and directly caught up with the Green Dragon Lord. During this process, a young green dragon blocked in front of Quayo. When Quayo flew past, it even wanted to bite him. But in the next second, this green dragon, that was more than 10 meters long, spun and flew into the distance. Its body was directly scorched by the high temperature and turned into a smoking wreckage. When it landed on the ground, it turned into a large piece of charred black debris. Bang! All of Morales' shields were easily destroyed by Quayo. A burst of green light flashed across Quayo's body, but it did not slow him down at all. The dragon's claws, which were wrapped in flames, hit the green dragon's body. 2 of Morales' wings were broken on the spot, and they drooped weakly at his side. She cried out in pain, but her body quickly shrank. After turning into a human, she disappeared in the air. With the advantage of invisibility and her body size, she managed to dodge Quayo's second attack. However, before she could fly far, Quayo, who had also transformed into a human, had already caught up with her like lightning. The elemental explosions caused by the collision of the 2 domains could be heard continuously, but Morales was obviously at a disadvantage. Quayo easily punched her in the shoulder. A punch from a demigod was not a simple physical attack. The impact of the punch sent Morales crashing to the ground. And the aftermath of this punch spread to the shield of the Helsinki magic tower hundreds of meters away, almost causing it to collapse on the spot. Boom! With a muffled sound, the human Morales was directly smashed into the ground. Quayo dove down from above, but before he landed, a white light suddenly lit up beside him. He thought that the other party wanted to attack him. When he turned his gaze, he saw the scene of Roddy raising his bow and shooting an arrow into the sky. What is he doing? Quayo did not think that shooting an arrow in this kind of battlefield could hurt the dragons. However, just as he was puzzled, the arrow bloomed in the air with a blue arcane halo. After this signal, Quayo suddenly found that the ground in front of him was covered in a white fog. His expression changed, and he immediately said angrily, "Krupus, are you also planning to plot against me?" The crystal dragons were best at using illusions. This fog was the characteristic of the crystal dragons when they used illusion spells. The most important thing was that the white fog could only be seen when the spell disappeared. In other words, this area was not what he saw just now. It was an illusion created by the crystal dragons. An illusion that even Quayo could not detect must have been created by a guy at the level of Krupus. Quayo immediately shouted the other party's name, and a flash of fear flashed in his heart. In order to prevent a sneak attack, he waved his hands around, and a violent wind pressure immediately rushed out. After blowing away the thick fog, he landed on the ground and saw the green dragon, Moralis, who was slowly standing up in front of him, and Krups, who was in human form and holding a magic staff not far from her. Moralis was also surprised at this moment. Obviously, she did not know that Krupus was lying in ambush here. But it seemed that the other party was obviously here to protect Efta and the other humans. With this thought, her face, which was injured by Quayo, showed a confident expression. "Quayo, are you still going to continue to be stubborn?" Quayo, whose body was burning with flames, clenched his fists. For a moment, he also regarded Krupus as Moralis' ally. He looked at him and whispered, "What does this mean?" Krupus held a crooked wooden staff in his hand and glanced at Quayo and Moralis. He shook his head, and as the tip of the staff touched the ground with a thud, the surrounding smoke began to dissipate slowly. The next moment, Quayo and Moralis' faces showed a shocked expression. Because when they looked around, they were actually surrounded by dragon fledglings. The dragon fledglings of the red dragons and green dragons had just fought in the sky. Previously, because of the existence of the Helsinki Magic Tower, there was a large number of casualties. Quayo thought that his dragon fledglings had suffered heavy losses, but now he saw that there were no motionless corpses on the ground. Instead, there were figures that were struggling but could not move because of the magic array. Their bodies were covered with ice chains, and there were green dragons and red dragons. At a glance, it was obvious that most of them were not injured and were simply imprisoned by magic. In other words, in the illusion just now, the opponents they were fighting were probably fake. Thinking deeper, even the enchantment of the Helsinki Magic Tower might be fake. Everything was an illusion created by the crystal dragon. What was going on? Quayo thought that he had fallen into a desperate situation because of what Moralis had said before. It was clear that she had joined forces with the other lords. But why were the red dragons and green dragons not injured? What was Krupus trying to do? Quayo, stop. It is not honorable to attack humans. Krupus's words made Moralis happy. Although she did not know why the other party had set up a maze here, it was obvious that he was talking about Quayo. So the green dragon lord followed up and said, "Now that things have come to this, do you still want to kill me?" The deaths and injuries of the other dragon fledglings were fake, but the terrifying wound on her shoulder was real. Her collarbone had collapsed, and her shoulder was slowly recovering. The green dragons had always been known for their tenacious vitality, and their healing ability at this moment was evident. She deliberately exposed the wound, as if she was silently accusing Quayo of brutality. The latter was at a loss for words. He was stunned and did not know how to answer. Krupus turned his head to look at her and said, "Moralis, what you want to do is only to stop Quayo? What do you mean?" Moralis frowned because she felt that the other party's attitude was a little strange. But before Krupus could reply, she felt a chill coming from behind her. As soon as she turned around, Moralis found that Victor was standing behind her. The Ice Dragon Lord was looking at her, and the last syllable of the spell had been silently recited. The bone-chilling cold spread instantly. Only then did Moralis realize that the other party was trying to imprison her. She immediately tried to struggle, but the spell she was about to recite was disrupted by a distorted elemental power. Krupus's psychedelic realm was colorless and invisible, but it had an extremely strong disturbance spell effect. Most importantly, it was obviously targeted at her. Morelos tried to remove the effect of the frost imprisonment by transforming, but under the attack of the two lords, she was caught off guard. Just as she stretched out her arms, Victor rushed over and punched her in the back, causing her to kneel on the ground. The violent frost power invaded her body through Victor's fist, and she could not even spit out half a syllable. Why, Morelos had lost her sense of body. Victor's psychedelic realm, combined with Krupus's disturbance spell, made the Green Dragon Lord completely lose the ability to struggle. Chapter 9:16. Quio didn't think that it was because he had established the Dragons Alliance. It wasn't news that the other dragons and the red dragons seemed to be united, but were actually at odds with each other. It was definitely not because they wanted to please him that they stood up to deal with the green dragon. The anger that he had just accumulated disappeared because of this sudden incident. He watched helplessly as the two lords froze Morelos in place. Then, he finally spoke. "What's going on?" A metal chain flashing with blue light wrapped around Morelos' body. The struggling Green Dragon Lord was in despair because she knew that this was the icy sigh, made by Victor using the power of the dragon crystal. She had just stepped into the demigod realm, so she couldn't resist such a powerful magic tool under the influence of another realm. "You have to ask Morelos." Krupus turned his head and glanced at the magic tower. Only then did Quio realize that the magic tower in the center of Ifta's camp had actually floated closer to them. He frowned and looked up. The huge magic tower was indeed indescribably oppressive to the dragons in human form. However, when the door of the magic tower opened and Roddy walked out, he realized that the whole situation was completely out of his expectations. As the Prime Minister of Ifta, Roddy's status was not low. However, when he stood among the dragons, his title was obviously not enough. After all, even the nominal king of the Kingdom of Karen, Charles II, had to bow and scrape in front of Quio. However, Roddy didn't act like he wanted to curry favor with the dragons at all. He walked in front of everyone with his short sword and nodded as a greeting. Krupus and Victor were not surprised at all. Only Quio frowned and looked at him. He said in a low voice, "Human, you have no right to speak here." However, what made him speechless was that Roddy didn't even pay attention to him. This feeling of being ignored made Quio furious. However, Victor said, "Quio, let's get to the bottom of this first. What is it? What are you doing?" He turned his gaze to Morelos, who was tied up in chains, and suddenly froze. "Is there something wrong with her?" "What's wrong with me?" Morelos couldn't break free, but he could still speak. She looked at Victor and Krupus, then at Roddy, who was standing in front of the magic tower. "Do you think I want to replace the red dragon? Let me tell you, I'm not interested." "Of course you're not interested, Lord Morelos." Roddy finally spoke. Although he addressed her respectfully, he obviously did not mean it. Instead, he squinted at her and said, "Because your goal was never to lead the dragons, but to disintegrate the so-called Dragons Alliance." But Morelos ignored him and turned to look at the lords on both sides. "Victor, Krupus, why aren't you saying anything? Do you really need a human to intervene in the affairs of the dragons?" Quio actually had the same idea as her, but Victor shook his head and said, "Today, Roddy must be present. Besides, this is not just an internal affair of the dragons." Krupus hit the ground with his wooden staff again, and a magic circle with a diameter of more than 10 meters suddenly appeared under everyone's feet. Morelos looked over, and his expression suddenly became very strange. What do you mean? Do you think that my bloodline is impure?" This magic circle, known as the Ring of Blood, was only used by the dragons. Its function was to detect whether the unhatched dragon eggs were baby dragons or normal dragons. In other words, it could verify the bloodline of a dragon's. However, Krupus did not answer her question. He just cooperated with Victor and moved her directly to the center of the magic circle. Then, the magic circle was activated. A white light lit up, and there were more than 25 rings of light flashing on the lines of the magic circle. Morales looked at her feet in confusion. She was very clear about the effect of this magic circle. When a dragon egg was placed on it, it would show the color of the dragon's bloodline. If the color was bright and pure, and there were no more than 3 dim rings of light, normal dragons could usually be hatched. If there were more than 10 dim rings of light, then it was most likely a baby dragon with low intelligence. Dragons classified their offspring in advance according to this method. After all, baby dragons could not be compared with normal dragons in all aspects, and the resources they enjoyed were also different. Morales was curious as to why they wanted to use this magic circle to test her. Before she could say anything, the light gradually lit up. As a green dragon lord, her bloodline was naturally pure, and the green halos that gradually lit up above the magic circle also showed this. Victor, Krupus, your joke is not funny at all. She looked in front of her. The effect of burning blood on Quayo's body was still there, but it was gradually fading. His expression was uncertain, and it was obvious that he was thinking about the situation in front of him. Victor and Krupus, on the other hand, were expressionless. They looked at him as if they were looking at an enemy, which made Morales even more unhappy. If you insist on mediating this war, why do you have to use this method? Don't think that green dragons are easy to bully. Before she finished speaking, Morales suddenly froze because the original green light had suddenly dimmed on the magic circle after the 18th ring. From the 19th to the 25th ring, all became gray, mixed with flashing purple light. It must be known that even the shadow dragons showed bright and dazzling purple on the magic circle. The gray and dark purple color made Morales' eyes suddenly widen. What's going on? You have been controlled by the devil without knowing it, Lord Morales. I have suspected this from the moment you approached the EFTA barracks. Roddy stood in the middle of the dragons and said calmly, I don't know where you came into contact with the devil, but it is obvious that they have affected your thinking without you knowing it. The magic circle had clearly explained the reason why Victor and Krupus appeared here. At this moment, Quayo finally understood why they wanted to control Morales at this time. But what made him shocked was that he knew nothing from the beginning to the end. It could even be said that he was used by these guys as a meat shield against Morales. Quayo, we didn't believe this at first, but think about it carefully. If Morales wanted to stop you, why did he deliberately start a war? Krupus's voice was neither fast nor slow, which made Quayo, who was unwilling to accept it, gradually calm down. Obviously, after knowing that Morales was controlled by the devil, the truth of her deliberately attacking Quayo and even the baby dragon legion was revealed. Morales' purpose was not to stop the war, but to start it. He deliberately let the EFTA barracks attack the red dragons, and at the same time, he brought the green dragons to fight the red dragons. No matter what the final result was, the dragons, and the humans would all be deeply wounded. Who benefited the most from this? Of course, it was the devil that might invade in the future. How is this possible? I am not a devil. I am the Green Dragon Lord. I am Morales, the spokesperson of the forest and the power of nature. Enough, Morales. You are the one who has no right to speak now. Victor interrupted her. Morales' chest heaved up and down violently, as if she could not believe what was happening in front of her. She looked around and struggled to shout, but before she could say anything, her head suddenly drooped down, and she fainted. The next moment, the rings on the magic circle suddenly began to change. The purplish-black light that originally only occupied 5 rings rapidly expanded like an infected virus, gradually invading the rings of green in the magic circle. When Roddy saw this, he immediately shouted, "Be careful!" Morales, who had her head lowered, suddenly let out a sharp howl. Along with this sound, her body began to change uncontrollably. The 2 horns on her head were wrapped in a layer of purple keratin, and purple scales that were different from dragon scales covered her skin. The remaining green rings on the magic circle had almost completely disappeared, but the last 2 rings of green seemed to be trying hard to resist this power. Moralis, who was bound by the icy psi chain, opened her eyes wide. When she looked at the lords beside her, she could not help but reveal a look of pain and pleading, but when her eyes stopped on Roddy, her twisted face suddenly calmed down. "It's you again." Moralis' green pupils had now completely turned black. She stared at Roddy and said these words fiercely. Then, she suddenly began to struggle. Countless bone spurs suddenly protruded from the surface of her human body, and the vine dress that she was wearing was torn apart. She did not care about the embarrassment of having no clothes to cover her body at all. She let out a strange roar, and at the same time, stretched out her arms to both sides. The icy psi chain actually broke on the spot with a snap. This meant that the opponent's strength had taken a qualitative leap in an instant. Quayo's expression changed drastically. He raised his hand and cast Wall of Flaming Sun to surround her. But a purple light flashed, and Moralis, who was under the influence of 3 domains, easily cut through the thick wall of fire. At the same time, she spread her purple wings and stepped out in the midst of the explosion. She immediately rushed towards Roddy, who was standing in the middle of the lords. Her body had become a half-dragon and half-demon state. Not only did she have strong magic resistance, she also had the strong recovery ability of the original green dragon. So, at this time, the high-temperature flames could not affect Moralis at all. She no longer used spells, but directly waved her sharp claws and directly smashed a huge pit in the area where Roddy was. Boom! Even if a demigod's attack was not cast, the pure physical force and the accompanying elemental impact was not something that ordinary people could withstand. Roddy did not even have time to dodge, and he and the magic tower behind him were blasted into pieces on the spot. Chapter 9:17. The matter in the Devil Tower was over, but the matter on the battlefield was not over. In this decisive battle, the only thing Ifta had done from beginning to end was blanket fire. Even the royal troops and the Viper Cross in Enrique City had been reduced to ashes in the flames. But this did not mean that the battle was over. The retreat of the enemy meant that the resistance had disappeared. Ifta still had to occupy, reorganize, dispose of the corpses, clean up the battlefield, and rebuild after the battle. The end of May was the time when the weather was hot. The corpses on the battlefield rotted very quickly. Most of the soldiers of the Viper Cross, who had been poisoned, were left naked on the battlefield because they had been stripped of their armor and weapons. It would not be an exaggeration to describe such a scene as corpses everywhere. After the death of Pope Daizé, the leaderless army had completely collapsed. But these exiled soldiers were a threat to the entire region. Roddy had already ordered the Rose Cross troops, who had been preparing for many days, to encircle the surrounding areas and ensure the safety of the other towns and villages. Ifta's own troops, on the other hand, only set off for Enrique City the next day. This time, it was the gigantic arcane puppet that led the charge. The compacted road allowed the artillery to follow them. For the 4 arcane puppets operating at full speed, it only took them 2 hours to cover a distance of less than 2 kilometers. When the soldiers arrived at the city, there were only 3 or 4 heads left on the city wall. There was no city gate here because the entire northern city wall had collapsed in the artillery fire. The soldiers could only see the ruins and countless corpses buried underneath. Those who remained in the city were the lucky survivors. Sodeler stationed the troops outside the city and waited for the arcane puppets to repair the road to the imperial city. "Commander, do we really not need to surround those escaping nobles?" In a simple tent set up outside the city, the advisors were holding post-war statistical reports and beaming with joy. But now they were more concerned about the whereabouts of the country's former ruler, Charles II. The falcons have been monitoring them. With Crone and the other mages escorting them, there's no point in chasing them now. Sodeler made a mark on the plan that he had flipped through countless times. The people brought by the fleet have already begun to plan a new plan for the construction of the port. Where else can this monarch go? In fact, Charles II, who was now on the run, had little ability to think. Your Majesty, the imperial city is our last barrier. With the help of the mages of the Dragon Tower and the help of the mages, Ifta's weapons are no longer a threat. Count Val, his face covered with grease and dust, kept giving advice to Charles II. Oh, let's talk when we get there. The king of the Cullen Kingdom looked haggard. He was drenched in sweat as he rode on his horse. Looking up at the cloudless sky, the figure of the falcon was hovering in the sky. They were already used to the buzzing sound of the propellers. At this moment, they no longer saw it as a threat. They were afraid of the albatross, but the latter never showed up. After Quio left Enrique City, the boundary that protected them suddenly disappeared at a certain moment. When they climbed the city wall and saw that Ifta's position was intact, Crone immediately joined the remaining 3 mages and 6 mages to escort the nobles out of the southern city gate. Charles II didn't give many orders during this process. He even thought of smashing his head against the wall of Enrique. That would be more satisfying than facing a situation where everything was lost. Half of the remaining nobles said they were willing to stay and buy time for Charles II to escape. Of course, Charles II didn't know that these people chose to surrender after the Ifta infantry division arrived. The people who were fleeing could basically become the core of the kingdom. More than 12 nobles gathered a guard of 70 to 80 people and fled to the imperial city from the southern city wall with Charles II and the mages. After running for a day, they finally arrived at a village 5 kilometers away from the imperial city. The villagers here didn't know what had happened and were surprised to see such a group of nobles dressed in gorgeous clothes. Your Majesty, do you need to rest for a while? Mage Crone was also exhausted. Even if he could use spells to reduce the burden on the warhorse, riding for more than 10 hours continuously was a great test of stamina. Even if he couldn't stand to use spells to float midway, it was inevitable that he was tired and haggard. No need to rest, let's go. Looking at the city not far away, the hungry Charles II decided to continue on his way. The sooner he returned to the city, the sooner the panic brought about by the artillery fire would be eliminated. Although he didn't know what he could do when he returned, the city still gave him a sense of security. Everyone, let's work harder. We're almost back to the imperial city. Count Val had done his best along the way. He was still some distance away from being a corps member, but this war made him feel that he had found an opportunity. After a brief adjustment, the group continued to speed up toward the imperial city. It only took them half an hour to travel the 5 kilometers. But as he gazed at the silent city walls and the tightly shut gates, Charles II felt an indescribable pressure. Who is it? The soldier on the city wall was not tall, and his loose clothes couldn't cover his thin body. Even his voice sounded weak. Below, Count Val immediately used the name of Charles II and asked to open the gate. The soldier was shocked and hurriedly said, "Okay." With a creaking sound, the suspension bridge of the imperial city moat was lowered, and after the wide city gate opened, the deserted street was a world of difference from when they left. Mage Crone frowned and said, "That's not right, there should be mages on the city wall." But he and Strange and the others behind him were only suspicious, and did not think about the possibility of the city falling. The long-distance raid had exhausted these mages who had not experienced war. Their lips were chapped, and at this moment, they just wanted to find a place to drink water and rest. Seeing the city gate open, Charles II finally let out a long breath. Even though his buttocks and thighs hurt badly, He tried his best to bear it and quickly led more than a dozen nobles into the city. Where are they? Hey! You stop, where are the city guards? Where are the mages on duty? Count Val also noticed something strange, but the thin soldier in front of him shook his head and retreated. My lord, I don't know anything. Why are you running? Come here and talk. Val still wanted to say something, but the soldier turned and ran, leaving the nobles who had just entered the city to look at each other. In the next moment, a whistling arrow was suddenly shot into the air. Amidst the sharp whistling sound, a large number of figures suddenly surged out from the surroundings. Clattering sounds of metal armors colliding resounded. When Charles II realized that these soldiers were fully clad in metal armors and wielding charged spears, his face instantly turned as pale as a sheet of paper. You, whose army are you? This was actually nonsense, because everyone saw the wolf head imprint on the soldier's armor. But even if they were surrounded, it was hard for them to imagine why the enemy would appear here. Clang. The sound of chains closing the city gate and the drawbridge being pulled made these people understand that they had no way out, but the surrounding soldiers were not in a hurry to attack. They just formed a semicircle and maintained a distance of about 30 meters and did not move forward. For Charles II and the others, who were all riding horses, this incomplete encirclement of infantry was really vulnerable, but what made them not dare to move were the crystal cannons set up on the streets not far away. For those who had experienced the power of cannon fire, even their breathing became cautious when such weapons were pointed at them at close range. Fortunately, Crone and the other archmages immediately began to release shields and boundaries. Rays of light flashed, and just as Charles II had the courage to continue speaking, he saw the air in front of him suddenly distort, and a strangely shaped black tower suddenly appeared on the wide street. The image of the Hersino magic tower was not unfamiliar to them, but the scene in front of them was really hard for Charles II to accept. He pulled out his long sword and murmured, "Fake! It's all fake! This must be an illusion created by magic. Crone, quickly destroy all of this." However, Crone did not move. He had observed the magic tower in front of him at close range when he was in Elson, and could certainly understand what it meant at this moment. Looking back at Strange and the other mages, he happily dismounted from his horse and waved his hand to remove the original shields and boundaries. "Your Majesty, forgive our incompetence, but this magic tower can't even deal with the dragons. Impossible. All of this is fake." Charles II pulled out his longsword. Although he tried to make his voice as loud as possible in the quiet battlefield, this kind of words that appeared tough but was actually weak showed his timidity. He looked forward to a response from the nobles behind him, and then everyone would charge together. Even if they died, they would die a heroic death. However, Charles II did not have the courage to charge, and the nobles around him had also lost the determination to fight to the death. Being aimed at by 8 crystal cannons and a magic tower in front of him, he could not escape. What other choice did he have except to surrender? At this moment, the door at the bottom of the magic tower opened, and Roddy and Sally, who was dressed in formal attire, stepped down. The soldiers in front of them slowly parted to both sides. Sally walked in front and Roddy followed from the side. When Duke stood still, Roddy still did not stand parallel to her. This was a dialogue between the royal family and the Lucifron family. Although he was in charge of the entire war, the end of the grudge was still left to Sally. Chapter 9:18. At this time, Morales had completely broken away from the image of a green dragon. If one were to describe it, it would be more like Teflon after his transformation. His body, strength, and speed had all changed dramatically. Her whole body radiated a violent demonic aura. When she waved her hands, the purple light already had a powerful corrosive ability. After the magic tower was smashed down with a huge magic impact, there were even several deep ravines on the ground, the corroded ground sizzled, and the surrounding weeds were infected by the aura and directly withered into a charred state. After getting rid of Roddy and the magic tower, Morales laughed loudly. At the same time, she turned around and began to attack Krupus, who was closest to her. The powerful impact instantly hit the crystal dragon's shield. Krupus raised his wooden staff, but before he could cast any spells, the shield had already been smashed by Morales. She rushed in front of the crystal dragon swiftly and violently. Her huge and sharp claws waved wildly, and the sound of impact suddenly became continuous. Krupus's passive shield was obviously much stronger. The spell he cast next was a large number of transparent crystal blades. But after these sharp blades hit Morales' abdomen, the green dragon lord forcibly withstood them. Her vine dress was torn apart, revealing her chest and abdomen covered with purple scales. At this moment, the scales were full of crystal fragments, but it obviously blocked almost all the impact. In the next second, she stretched out her transformed dragon tail. The tip of the tail was full of bone spurs like a spear. With a poof, it pierced through Krupus' chest and instantly flung him away. The sharp claws followed up and tore at Krupus. Amidst the sound of shattering, Krupus became a pile of meat under the violent attack. Morales roared excitedly. At this moment, her voice was no longer a dragon's roar, but a strange kind of excited hissing. In the process, she had been hit by Victor's ice attacks 3 or 4 times. When Krupus was shattered, she turned around and smashed the Ice Dragon Lord's shield with ice shards all over her body. Victor tried to imprison her with chains one after another, but Morales spread her wings and broke free. She raised her hand and swatted away Quio's fist. She ignored the blazing flame aura and folded her bony wings. A purple corrosive aura gushed out and bombarded Victor's body on the spot. The latter's shield was corroded, and when he raised his hands to block, Morales had already reached out and pierced his abdomen, causing sharp claws to emerge from Victor's back. "What did you do?" As soon as she flung Victor away, Quio angrily punched her in the back, sending her flying more than 30 meters away. Morales' spine was fractured by the blow, and his body was deformed. However, she reached out her hand and pressed on her waist. With a kacha sound, she forcefully pressed the dislocated bone back into place. In less than 3 seconds, her flattened abdomen and broken spine were restored to their original state in the purple radiance. She roared and rushed towards the stunned Quio once again. Damn it, Quio's mind could not keep up. He looked around in bewilderment and found nothing but ruins and minced meat on the ground. Morales was unbelievably powerful, but how could Victor and Krupus be killed in one blow? However, the demonized Morelos did not have such rationality. She was like a berserk beast that only knew how to attack all living things in front of her. The two of them attacked and defended with great momentum. As the effect of burning blood gradually faded, Quio found that he was quickly falling into a disadvantageous position in the melee battle. His opponent's fierce attacks were no longer based on the force of nature, but on the highly corrosive demon power. A large part of Quio's robe and skin were rapidly corroded during the battle. This effect made it difficult for him to maintain his shield. The pain and the suppression of his strength made Quio realize that he could not just wait for death. Thus, he gritted his teeth and immediately transformed into a giant dragon. As he leaped backward, he intended to spit out a mouthful of dragon breath. As a result, Morales, who was in front of him, transformed as well. This time, Morales, who had transformed into a dragon, was nearly twice as large as Quio. 70% of the green scales on her body had turned purplish-black. Their shape was also different from dragon scales. Instead, they had turned into armor with prismatic spikes. Her wings were enchanting and complicated patterns. Her originally green pupils had now turned pure black. It was impossible to tell where her focus was. Quio's dragon's breath hit her body, and the magma-like flames only caused a small burn on her chest. However, The dragon's breath that she counterattacked had corroded a large hole with a diameter of more than 2 meters on Queel's entire wing. Her gigantic body allowed her strength to surpass even that of the Red Dragon Lord. Her gigantic claws and her body collided with Queel's, leaving him unable to retaliate. After 3 clashes, he screamed and fell into the ruins of the Helsinki Magic Tower. Seeing his opponent rushing towards him again, Queo was about to get up and defend himself. However, he suddenly found that his opponent was attacking the air beside him crazily, as if she did not see him at all. The Red Dragon Lord looked to his left and right and suddenly found a large white fog rising from both sides. 2 layers of illusions. He suddenly realized that what he saw just now was not the real world, but the second layer of Krupa's illusion. This trap was too deep. While Queo was shocked, he also felt inexplicably relieved. The person who designed this trap did not target him. Otherwise, even if he brought the fledgling Dragon Legion with him, he would still be toyed to death in here. Just as he finished lamenting, he saw Morales, who was in the fierce battle, not far away, gasping for breath. Because Morales did not seem to have any enemies in her eyes. While she was in a daze, a white light suddenly appeared and hit the right side of her face. Boom! This blow was like a big stick that violently smashed on the head. Morales' neck was thrown to the other side on the spot, and her whole body almost flipped over. After the thunderous explosion, Queo suddenly felt that his body was being pulled forward by a strange suction force. He looked up and saw the black dragon Hurlo Lord Pucasto rushing behind Morales and slapping her heavily on the ground with his claws. The black dragon Hurlo's force of earth could forcibly increase gravity within a certain range. Morales tried to fight back, but her body lost its balance because of the pull of gravity and was quickly knocked down. As Morales fell to the ground, the entire illusion began to shatter and dissipate on a large scale. Queo took a closer look and realized that there were no ruins of the Magic Tower there at all. The real Helsinki Magic Tower was actually standing hundreds of meters away. On the top of the tower, Roddy's figure was overlooking this place, unharmed. The ray of light just now came from this direction. This powerful attack made him secretly shocked. But Queo had no time to care about Roddy at this time, because the struggling Morales had adapted to the gravity of more than 40 times, and stood up again with a roar. But Pucasto's melee ability was much stronger than Queo's. His figure was similar to the demonized Morales, and his dark scales were attached with dark yellow earth armor. He was not afraid of the opponent's corrosive attack at all. Because he could control the force of earth, he directly suppressed Morales while standing on the ground. The Green Dragon Lord, who tried to bite Morales, was hit by the magic rays one after another. Amidst the cries of pain, the real bodies of Victor and Pucasto appeared on both sides. Queo immediately stepped forward to help, and the situation changed completely. It became a one-sided fight between the 4 lords and the Magic Tower against Morales. Under the siege of the 4 lords, Morales resisted stubbornly but could not resist at all. Because in a battle between demigods, the appearance of a domain had an unusually strong impact on the situation. After Morales demonized, his own domain was weakened because of the repulsion of the demonic power. On the other hand, when the 4 lords fully released their domains, Morales could not resist at all. Because of the influence of the 4 domains, not only was it difficult for her to cast spells successfully, but she was also restrained by the gravity domain of the black dragon Hurlo in a head-on battle. Her movements were slowed by the ice and she had to endure the fire damage. In less than 10 seconds, her wings were directly broken and torn off by Pucasto. The next moment, the frost chain and the mist of illusion wrapped around Morales at the same time. The huge green dragon was directly pressed to the ground by the black dragon Hurlo. At this moment, the originally scorched ground suddenly changed. Quio stared at the huge magic circle with a diameter of more than 300 meters in front of him, and for a moment, he could not even speak, because he found that his judgment of the double illusion was wrong. There were actually 3 illusions in the entire battlefield. Looking around, he found that the range of the illusion boundary had extended to a kilometer. Such a large scale really made Quio feel a chill down his spine, because at this moment, the edge of the illusion boundary was still in operation, which meant that, from the perspective of Enrique City, one could not see the scene of their battle at all. What the people outside saw completely depended on the mood of Krupus. Compared to the elemental power of other dragons, this was the real scary thing about the crystal dragon. This seemingly flat battlefield was forcibly arranged into a visual maze. Morales was thrown to the center of the magic circle while he struggled. As Victor activated the magic circle, the thousands of magic crystal on the ground that had been prepared long ago lit up at the same time. The constantly struggling Morales was suddenly wrapped up by the spherical boundary that appeared in the center of the magic circle. In an instant, the struggling Morales was like an insect wrapped in amber, and his movements became extremely slow. Victor, Pucasto, and Krupus all returned to their human forms, closed their own domains, and stepped onto the nodes of the magic circle. Seeing this, Quio also transformed and planned to go to the last node to output magic power. However, the Helsinki magic tower flew directly to this position. Edith's shadow was one step ahead of him. With the help of the energy of the magic tower, she controlled the energy output of this huge magic circle. Chapter 9:19. Morales' movements became slower and slower. No matter how hard she struggled, the enchantment seemed to be as stable as a rock and showed no signs of collapsing. Quio knew that this enchantment was an enlarged version of the Ice Sorrows. It was originally a prison for the members of the dragons who had committed crimes. To create such an enchantment, even a lord would need 3 days to prepare. At this moment, the crystal cannons and infantrymen of the Ifta camp were no longer the main characters of this battle. The pitiful soldiers of Enrique City were also completely ignored. The meaning of this war was no longer about the struggle of human forces. Among the 5 dragon lords, one of them had her mind eroded by a demon without knowing it. This situation meant an unknown fear for the other 4 lords. Were they eroded by the demon? Were their own people eroded by the demon? What if they went back to investigate and found out that something was wrong with them? No one said these words, but the emotions brewing in their hearts had spread. They adjusted the strength of the enchantment. This enchantment not only had the effect of confinement, but it could also quickly disintegrate the elemental energy in the enchantment. Therefore, Morales was soon unable to use any spells. After struggling to no avail, she finally exhausted herself and stopped. Her eyes were still glowing purple, but she did not look at the 4 dragons in front of her. Instead, she looked straight at Roddy at the top of the magic tower not far away. At this moment, after confirming that everything was safe, Roddy finally jumped down from the top of the tower and walked to a place not far away from the enchantment. It seems that the demon's hatred for you is not ordinary. As the Lord of the Dragons who was most familiar with Roddy, Victor took the initiative to speak at this moment. Roddy nodded. He first gave a simple salute to the Lords of the Dragons and then explained, when the demon gate was dismantled, the guy from the demonic plane should have remembered my appearance. Now it seems that the demon who eroded Lord Morales should be someone familiar. The demonized Morales opened her mouth at the approaching Roddy and expressed her hatred with a hissing sound. The spherical barrier was continuously struck by her sharp claws, but not a single crack appeared. When the other feudal lords saw this scene, they turned to look at Quio. Quio had boasted about the battle to close the demon's gate many times among the dragons, making the other dragons think that Quio had done it alone. But this scene clearly proved that the closure of the demon's gate was closely related to Roddy. Otherwise, Morales' primary target would have been Quio. Why would he hate a human so much? The Helsinki Magic Tower activated its enchantment, and the Grand Arcanist Edith created another invisible barrier in the sky. The Green Dragon Lord, who was grimacing in pain, suddenly knelt on the ground with a pale face. After struggling for a while, it suddenly flipped backwards and lay inside the enchantment, completely unconscious. I've tried my best to cut off the space-time connection of the barrier. This way, I can slightly prevent the mental invasion from the other plane. Edith's explanation made the feudal lords narrow their eyes. This was not something an ordinary character could do. Human mages were still a distance away from mastering space-time spells. Only the feudal lords and elders among the dragons could have this ability. And Edith belonged to Roddy's force. This allowed Roddy, as a human, to have the same weight in the meeting of the feudal lords of the dragons. He was no longer an ant that could be ignored like Charles II. Kyle was very unhappy about this. Although he did not want Roddy to have such a position, the main problem at the moment was the betrayal of Morales. He pointed at the unconscious Green Dragon Lord and said, "In this situation, I'm afraid we have no other way to deal with it." The dragon's way of dealing with demons was very straightforward. The shadow dragons were the most straightforward example. To prevent the demon from infecting more dragons, Morales must be executed, Kaio said gloomily. Queo said with a gloomy expression. Such a proposal should be able to reach a consensus. He glanced around. The crystal dragon Krupus narrowed his eyes, and Victor frowned without saying a word. Pocahontas said bluntly, "Queo, it's easy to kill a lord, but how do you know how many green dragons are in the same situation? The shadow dragons are an example. There is no room for compromise in this situation." Queo's method was simple and crude. He used the same method he used against the shadow dragons, eliminating all the green dragons to prevent the demons from affecting the dragons as a whole. "I have something to say." At this time, the dragons didn't speak, but Roddy's voice abruptly interrupted Queo. The latter was shocked and angry at the same time. He stared at Roddy with a sharp gaze. "You have no right to speak here. Humans." However, Krupus raised his eyebrows. "Queo, if he hadn't told us about Morales' situation in advance today, you probably wouldn't have been able to go back. This is not just about the dragons. Roddy is the leader of EFTA and the future representative of the entire kingdom of Karen. Why can't we listen to him?" Victor also stood up. At this time, Black Dragon Herlo Pucados shrugged. "There's no loss in listening to him, is there?" 3-1. The other lords unanimously stood on Roddy's side. This situation made Queo suddenly feel an unprecedented pressure. He wanted to say something, but he hesitated. In the end, he remained silent. Seeing that Queo had shut up, Roddy bluntly said, "I learned from Lord Victor that the proposal to wipe out the shadow dragons many years ago was put forward by Lord Queo. At that time, Lord Krupus and Lord Victor opposed it, but Lord Morales chose to support it. Including Lord Queo and Lord Pucados, this proposal was finally passed, and it led to the end of the shadow dragons. This was not a secret. The shadow dragons had completely disappeared, so it was not a problem to talk about it now. However, there was a very important message in Roddy's words. The green dragons had always lived in seclusion. Why would they clearly support the elimination of the shadow dragons in this matter? Let's not talk about the process. The result now is that the dragons have forever lost the lineage of the shadow dragons. And now, Lord Queo said that the green dragons should also be dealt with in the same way. If this proposal is also passed, then how many dragons will be left on this continent in the future? If the dragons are allowed to be corrupted by the demons, then the consequences will be even more unimaginable. Queo frowned and retorted, "Will you only be satisfied when the dragons become the demons' puppets?" This was also something that the other lords were worried about. As the highest combat power, the dragons were of the same level. No one could command the other. Once an entire clan rebelled, the consequences would be unimaginable. There were red and green dragon fledglings tied up by ice chains on the ground. There were more than 100 of them. Their faint hissing made Kao's words seem even more serious. But Roddy shook his head. Perhaps the lords see things differently from me when they stand at the same level as the dragons. But from a human's point of view, the biggest purpose of the demons' invasion of the dragons may not be to control a certain dragons, but to create chaos. They hope that when they come here, there will be no unified resistance on the entire continent. And in order to achieve this goal, the demons' primary goal is to create cracks within all the alliances. These were the words of an outsider. The few lords were not stupid. They also suspected whether there was an external force driving the cracks, but as lords they had to be involved in all kinds of struggles. Even if they were demigod-level experts, even if they knew that someone was a traitor, the traitor wouldn't stick that title on their head. Rashly suspecting someone could easily lead to even greater conflicts and contradictions. Roddy stood outside the circle of dragons and pointed out this point. In fact, he was the one who said, "The Emperor is naked," because regardless of whether the lords found the traitor or not, the cracks between them had been widening to the point where it was now. In other words, no matter how Morales was dealt with, the demons had already succeeded. The shadow dragons have disappeared. If the green dragons also perish because of this, it would be equivalent to cutting off 1/3 of the high-end combat power on the continent in the future. I think the demons would be happy to see such an outcome. Roddy pointed to Morales. Being invaded by the demons is not incurable. Now that the cause has been confirmed, we just need to find a way to deal with it. If you start a massacre because of this, Lord Quio, then I have to suspect your motives. This was obviously a suspicion that Quio was the so-called traitor. The latter laughed out loud, then glared at Roddy and said, "You suspect me? What right do you have to suspect me?" "Quio, now that things have come to this, I think it is necessary to verify it." Victor pointed to the small magic circle next to him that was used to verify Morales's identity. "All the dragons present, including me, should undergo a test. This method has not been used on the shadow dragons before, but it has indeed been proven to be effective. To tell you the truth, Quio, I regret agreeing to your proposal." Pucatos walked directly to the magic circle and pointed to his feet. "I am willing to lead by example to confirm that there is no problem with our decision-making level." "Pucatos? Why did you listen to him?" Quio was a little confused. The space-time rift that he promised them was not a cheap resource. What charm did Roddy have to make them stand on the side of the humans? "Quio, the problem lies in the space-time rift." Krupus raised his hand and pointed. The magic circle used to verify the bloodline was quickly activated. The pale yellow light that symbolized the Earth Dragon lit up in circles. Until the end, it still maintained its original purity. This meant that there was no problem with Pucatos' identity. After Pucatos walked down the magic circle, Krupus walked up to him and continued, "The sudden appearance of the space-time rift may be a trap from the demonic plane. We strongly suspect that prolonged contact with the special space-time rift will eventually lead to the invasion of the demons." Chapter 920. Although Roddy is a human, he is also a witcher. Due to his sensitive sense of demons, he immediately noticed that something was wrong with Morales. More importantly, Roddy has the ability to track the space-time fissure and determine whether it has a demonic aura. I think that with this alone, he is qualified to stand here and talk to us. Victor's words struck Quio like he was struck by lightning. He really did not expect that an ordinary human would have an ability that even the dragons did not have. The space-time fissure had always been something that the dragons could only come across. Even the lords could only search for it using stupid method. If a human could search for the spacetime fissure, Quio would definitely take him as his own and use him as a detector. But when this person's identity was Prime Minister Eiffel and also a witcher, Ko understood that this kind of thing could only be wishful thinking. Thinking about it carefully, Roddy's ability was totally a strategic existence. As long as the future dragons still needed the spacetime fissure, then Roddy's safety must be guaranteed. He had revealed his ability here, and he also had the backing of a high elf Grand Arcanist. With the dragons restraining each other, no one could touch him, and he even had the right to speak with the dragons. Countless thoughts flashed through Quio's mind. Only then did he understand why Morales dared to stand here so openly. But this situation also meant that his plan to raise a puppet was ruined. This was because Roddy's current identity was already the best partner of the dragons. His status was also enough for the human forces to get rid of their status as puppets and become an existence on par with the dragons. At this time, a large blue light had already lit up in front of Victor. After confirming that there was no mistake, he walked down the magic circle. Quio knew that it was his turn. He stepped forward, his expression unusually gloomy. It was already a foregone conclusion that the red dragon's right to speak would disappear. This time, the reshuffle of power within the dragons, he did not expect that it would be caused by a human. As he was thinking about this, the circles of red light on the magic circle lit up one after another. The blazing light didn't have any other colors. Quio didn't even think about the possibility of being attacked by the demons. However, just as he was about to walk down the magic circle, a faint purplish-black light shone in the innermost circle of the magic circle, causing all the lords present to feel as if they were facing a great enemy. "Quio!" Pocatos roared, "Damn it! It turns out that you are the most well-hidden traitor. No wonder you have to go through all this trouble." Victor and Krupus also raised their staffs and swords. Intense elemental fluctuations instantly rippled in the surroundings. A giant shield condensed by the magic tower appeared in front of Roddy, firmly protecting him. Meanwhile, Quio's face was filled with shock. He looked at the purplish-black dot at the end of the formation and understood that this formation couldn't be fake. However, how is this possible? Quio lowered his head and looked at his hands. Everything was normal. He did not grow any purple scales, and he was not confused by the frenzied will. Be it his mind or his body, he did not feel anything strange. "I am not being controlled. Listen to me." Before Quio could finish speaking, the three lords had already fully activated their domains. Pocato's fist had already landed on Quio's abdomen. This red dragon lord did not even think of resisting. At this time, he had taken a solid punch. Moreover, because of the gravity that was tens of times stronger than usual, he knelt on the ground. Before he could stand up, he was restrained by more than 10 spells on the spot. Not far away, Iskar and the others stared blankly at this scene. Before they could say anything, the other three lords ordered them to be pressed down. The members of the Black Dragon Hurlo, the Ice Dragon, and the Crystal Dragons quickly took action. The Red Dragons could not resist at all and were immediately restrained by various spells on the spot. What exactly is going on? Quio's punch was not light. He did not think of resisting, so his whole body was firmly pressed to the ground in the gravity field. His eyes were wide open as he looked at the few lords standing at the side. Pocatos squinted his eyes and squatted beside him. His raised arm was already covered with dragon scales. This meant that he could launch a terrifying attack at any time. Quio did not doubt that his opponent could smash his head into pieces. But wasn't this all a little too fast? "Quio, can you feel other voices in your mind?" Krupus and Victor consciously maintained the operation of the spell formation, so they did not move. The Crystal Dragon Lord's magic staff stopped moving. Everything in Quio's field of vision suddenly disappeared, leaving only endless white. On the other hand, Rhodey and the other feudal lords' positions had also shifted. Quio knew that in the realm of nothingness, he could no longer use his vision or spirit to lock on to his target. At the same time, this place was also isolated from the outside world. No sound or any information could be transmitted. He understood that the other party was trying to block out external interference, so he immediately replied, "No. I have never heard any other voices, nor did I have any hints." "Check again," Victor suggested. Pucatos immediately reached out and picked him up, placing him on the spell formation to verify his bloodline. This time, the spell formation still showed a little dark purple, but it was obviously much smaller than before. If one did not deliberately observe it, it would be almost impossible to notice. The influence of the demons obviously comes from the spirit. I think it is most likely related to the space-time rift. Roddy, who was standing at the side, spoke again. This time, even Quio pricked up his ears to listen carefully to his conclusion. After all, on the issue of the space-time rift, Roddy had the ability and authority that the other lords could not compare to. Lord Quio, I guess that after the discovery of the large number of space-time rifts near the Red Dragon territory, you should have spent a long time studying their origins, so you have always been in close contact with them? He did not dare to ignore Roddy's question because the other three lords were also staring at him. Quio nodded. "Yes, that's right. Then I think these strange space-time rifts might be the culprit." As he spoke, he turned his gaze to the still unconscious Morlars. Morlars was still unconscious in the spherical barrier, but the purple scales on the surface of his body had completely disappeared. The protruding bone spurs on his arms and back had also faded. At this time, he had almost returned to the appearance of a normal green dragon lord. Lord Morlars has been in the forest all year round, so it is not an accident that she came into contact with the space-time rift. She might have been eroded by the demons without knowing it. Roddy's words were not entirely speculation. In the inheritance of demonic knowledge brought by the demon's heart, there were various examples of spiritual erosion. There were many demon lords. Most of them were good at physical combat, and only a few demon lords could exert influence on the spirit level. However, this kind of erosion was often more terrible than simple demonization. He briefly explained these things, and the lords had an idea in their hearts. Not only did they have a judgment about what happened in front of them, but they also had a similar speculation about what happened to the shadow dragons. Obviously, the shadow dragons who touched the taboo should have been the first to be eroded, and Quio should have been normal before because he also participated in the closing of the Demon's Gate incident. If he had been eroded at that time, the Demon Lord and Augustine at that time would not have failed. In other words, Quio's mind must have been eroded recently. Half of the 6 great dragon clans have already fallen. Victor looked at the scene in front of him and sighed helplessly. As the most powerful force on the continent, they were unknowingly manipulated by the demons into infighting. If it were not for Roddy's collaboration and plan today, the future would be unimaginable. The 3 lords were silent for a moment. Then, Black Dragon Hurlo Pucato sighed. "What do we do now? Quio, do you think we need to execute you and Morlars together?" These words were meant to embarrass Quail on purpose. When the tragedy happened to others, he shouted louder than anyone else, but when it was his turn, how could Quio really commit suicide? Now that we have figured out the reason, we naturally cannot make the same mistake again. Krupus's words could be considered to have settled this matter. This sentence naturally told Roddy that the previous encirclement and killing of the shadow dragons was wrong. We should learn from this lesson. If we continue to kill each other because of this, we will really be a joke to the demons. Victor turned to look at Quio. The latter finally heaved a sigh of relief, but then he felt a little embarrassed. Because if it were not for Roddy's words, there was a high probability that he would have been directly eliminated today. Even his clansmen and the fledgling Dragon Legion would have been buried together with him. Roddy, who was standing among the lords, did not have the intention to be complacent at this moment. He just walked to the side of Lord Morlars and said, "Under this kind of isolation, should we use the magic circle to check on her condition?" This suggestion was naturally approved. Krupus's barrier contained the law of space and time, so Quio's condition was somewhat alleviated. If this method was effective, perhaps Morlars could still be saved. After transferring the spherical barrier to the bloodline detection magic circle, the results of activation were indeed as expected. The black in the halos had faded by 30% compared to before, and it continued to fade slowly as time passed. With such a result, Quio's hanging heart was also relieved. "I can still be saved. It is not the worst time yet. I think there is no objection to the royal war between Efta and Charles II. Victor seemed to have changed the topic, but in fact, he was redefining the situation. Today we can stop the two lords from falling into the abyss, and Prime Minister Roddy's contribution cannot go unnoticed. In the future, if the Kingdom of Karen needs assistance in the Frost Dragon race, I am willing to contribute to it." His statement was a reward to Roddy. Naturally, Krupus and Pukatos had no objection. They certainly understood the principle of interdependence, so they expressed their intention to support Roddy. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.